Hey everybody, welcome on our channel. In this video we are gonna see, what if Naruto was the avatar of the 4 dragons? Part 1. Huge shout out to Kyu No Ken for this story. If you are new on the channel, don't forget to subscribe our channel and like the video too. So without wasting any more time, let's start the story. The little girl is being carried to her bed as she rests her head on her mom's shoulder, opening her eyes revealing bright blue eyes. She looked at her mom. "Mommy?" Replied her mother. "Can you tell me a bedtime story?" "Which story you want to hear, little one?" asks her mom softly as she looked at her daughter, eyes of the same shade of color as the little girl, and a splitting image of an older version of the little girl, as she set her on the bed. "The story of the first avatar," said the girl excitedly. Chuckling softly, the mother sat next to her child and closed her eyes, beginning her tale. According to legend, many centuries ago, the 4 nations were once filled with war and destruction. At a valley where 2 giant statues stood, giant waterfalls dividing it. 2 figures were fighting with all their might and trying to slay one another as they used their most powerful attacks in their arsenal, both tired and injured from their clash. Chaos and death ruled over the nations as war kept raging throughout the lands. A raven-haired teen wearing a tattered white long-sleeved shirt which was open at the torso, a family crest of a fan etched on his back, with black pants and a blue cloth hanging from halfway up his stomach to his knees. A purple rope belt around his waist, tied in a bow, his sword drawn as he swung to strike down his foe with vengeance with a loud yell. But one man, whose life was one of pain and misery for housing a powerful being since the day he was born. The blonde teen with whisker-like marks adorning his cheeks, was blocking the oncoming sword strike with his black metal arm bracers on his forearms, his upper body cut and bruised from battle, loose white kung fu pants tattered by the battle he raged against the raven-haired foe. Strode to end the meaningless war that had taken the lives of his loved ones and mastered the spirit's power by fusing with it his own. Deflecting the sword away from himself, both jumped away each other. The blonde and the raven-haired teen stared at each other defiantly as both refused to bend at each other's will to victory. His power being unmatched when reaching its peak, unleashing it on those who threaten his home. Having no choice but to eliminate the one he once considered a brother, the blonde slowly closed his eyes and searched deep within himself to unleash the power that no one possessed. Like a dragon that he was, gentle and calm as it slept, but when awakened. The dragon becomes fearsome and deadly when threatened. Energy began to dance around him as tattoos slowly began to appear on parts of his body till they became visible, but his most noticeable feature were the 4 dragons of each element, fire, water, earth and wind tattooed on his back as they glowed a bright crimson with the rest of his new features, opening his eyes, the once ocean blue. They were now crimson as blood as he glared at his once brother. Allowing him to bend the very same elements of nature to a point never thought possible as he used them with his very will. The blonde began to do Tai Chi forms as his body became relaxed and his breathing was controlled, fluently motions he did with his hands as the water itself began to move towards him, circulating around him as he changed his tempo, but the breathing remained the same. Currents of air came to him, surrounding him like a tornado, mixing with the water as it became ice inside the tornado, with the blonde standing in the middle of the razor ice typhoon. The raven-haired prepared his final assault as he unleashed a blazing torrent of black flames from his eyes, big enough to destroy a small army, sending it straight at the blonde in hopes of finally killing him. In order to fight the last remaining threat. Seeing the incoming flames, the blonde unleashed his attack as he jumped in the air in a circular motion and landed on his feet with both hands extended forward, sending the typhoon towards his enemy in hopes of ending it permanently. Both attacks meeting head-on, colliding with each other as the power struggle reached its max, to finally end in a bright flash of light as it exploded, consuming everything in reach. In order to achieve peace and balance in the land. The blonde and the raven-hair warrior still held their stance as the light became brighter and brighter till they were both consumed by the explosion of their attacks. Only for him to disappear without a trace, leaving the world in wonder as to what had happened to him. The valley was left in ruins in the aftermath of the battle the 2 waged on. But neither of the 2 were found, both vanishing without a trace. At a village far away from the valley, a woman was giving labor to a child, a healthy boy with tattoos similar to the ones of the blonde glowing faintly a sky blue. With his mysterious death, a new bender of the 4 elements was born and thus the avatar cycle began. The young girl and her brother both stumbled in a circular iceberg with a person trapped deep within. The girl using her limited knowledge of waterbending, she broke the dome in half, letting the compressed air to come out and both peeked inside, surprised to find frozen kid with an arrow on his head, wearing clothes worn by the air nomads. But some refused to believe that the crimson avatar had died. My name is Naruto Namikaze, a blonde person wearing white loose kung fu pants with black leather kung fu shoes and black metal leg bracers adorning from the insteps of his feet to halfway his shins. A dark blue sleeveless vest covered his upper body, and both forearms were adorned with black metal bracers on each forearm. Introduced himself as he extended his hand forward for a handshake to a light brown-skinned girl with bright blue eyes. My name is Katara. The young girl, who looked around 16 or 17, replied back shyly as she shook hands with him and noticed how handsome the young man looked, but saw that he held a lot of pain and loneliness in his eyes. Some believed that he had gone into a deep meditative sleep, only to awaken when he was needed once again. This is a surprise. I would have never thought I would meet the Crimson Avatar after 3,000 years, the spirit of the library exclaimed with mild surprise. Crimson Avatar. Katara thought to herself in shock as she processed what the owl spirit had said, confusing Sokka and Aang, since they didn't know what was so special about it. Naruto, why did he call you the Crimson Avatar when it was said he lived 3,000 years ago? Katara asked the blonde as they stared at each other's eyes, hoping the blonde would clarify the spirit's claim. Closing his eyes, sighing, Naruto answered her question. He calls me by one of the titles given, because I was there 3,000 years ago. I was the one who brought balance to the world. In order for once again, protect the four nations from the wielder of the darkness flames. Underneath the hidden caverns of Ba Sing Se. Naruto stared in disbelief at the person he thought he would never in his wildest imagination see ever again, to suddenly scowl in rage as he let his power loose, his tattoos glowing their crimson glow. Sasuke. It has been a long time since our last battle, hasn't it, Avatar of the Four Dragons, Sasuke said emotionlessly as he stared passively at the blonde dark flames being let loose around him, circulating him in a pillar of flames as they both got ready to settle the score. Sasuke, almost drained out of energy, gathered the last of his remaining strength into his right, black electricity cackling, running towards his enemy as called out his attack. One last time. Naruto, feeling exhausted and drained from battle, he focused on the palm of his right hand a small sphere, making grow larger and larger as he added the wind element into his attack, a loud whistling noise being heard as its form was completed in the form of a giant shuriken and rushed towards his foe, shouting his attack. Gyutun. Rasen Shuriken. Jidri Nagashi. Once and for all. But alas, no one knows what exactly had happened to him or to where his whereabouts are, but one thing is for certain, he was never forgotten, for by the mere mention of his title, the leaders of the four nations never dared to disturb the balance of the lands, for they didn't want to awaken him and invoke his wrath, until now. Aya finished her story as she opened her eyes and saw that her daughter had fallen asleep as she snored softly in her pillow. Smiling softly, the mother slowly stood up so she wouldn't awaken her and pulled the covers over her, causing the little girl to snuggle deeper in her covers. Good night, Katara, my little waterbender, said Kaya as she leaned forward and gave her daughter a soft kiss on the forehead, turned off the light candles, causing the room to go dark as she walked out of the room. Deep within a library, hidden from the world as it sat underneath the sands of the Earth Kingdom, a man sat in a desk, with a vast of scrolls laying around the table and the walls, looking for any mean to help him defeat and conquer his enemies, but unfortunately, all of his efforts were in vain, and in frustration, he tossed the scrolls aside. Arghh, useless scrolls. None of them contain any important information on the other nations. Yelled the man as he stood up and tore his hand through his hair in frustration and was about to walk away, till out of the corner of his eye, he saw a scroll, resting between the teeth of a carved-shaped dragon's head. The insignia of the four elements marked at each different corner in a quadrilateral shape. Curiosity gaining the best of him, the man walked towards the carving and slowly reached for the scroll. Seeing that nothing had happened when he touched it, he began to pull the scroll in attempts to break it free of its confined, but just as he pulled, the dragon's head clicked, making him get cautious, but the dragon only dropped its lower jaw, releasing the scroll. The man backed away from the dragon's carving and sat down at the chair he used and slowly unrolled the scroll, reading its contents in it, only to read a legend of old. Legend of the Avatar of the Four Dragons. Long before the Avatar came to existence. And the knowledge of bending the elements became a way of life. The rule of the shinobi dictated over the nations. Waging war through the continents as they strived to conquer each other. Leaving death and destruction in its wake. Innocent lives lost in its aftermath. But one child, who was chosen to jail a mighty spirit beast. Scorned and hated, terrorized and beaten. Stepped forward and strove to end the wars. Fusing his life energy with the spirit bound within him. Gained the abilities to control the elements themselves by will. And unleashed it onto the world. Like a dragon soaring through the lands. Defeating every threat in his path. His power unmatched by no one. As the marks of his body glow red. 4 dragons marking on his back. Brought peace to the world. Despite the power he contained, he was still human. And sought to pass his knowledge to 4 disciples. teaching them the fighting arts he created for each element, bringing balance as he divided his knowledge. Sadly, the peace was disrupted once again. As the wielder of the dark flames came, seeking to destroy with his flames of vengeance, only to clash with the dragon himself. Long and hard they fought. They only disappear in the end without a trace. And with the death of the Crimson Avatar, a new master of the elements was born. Thus, the cycle of the Avatar came to be. Taught by the disciples of the first Avatar, the new Avatar learned to master the elements, maintaining the peace and balance for generations to come, only to disappear once again in the world's time of need. Foretold, it has been. One day the Avatar of the Four Dragons shall awaken once again. Delight the courage of those who lost hope. Unite the people to fight for peace. And rectify the wrongs of the lands. By defeating the same evil that fought him long ago. And once again, bring order to the world. Finishing reading what the scroll contained, the man scoffed and threw the paper across the room as it landed with a clank as he picked up the torch and walked out of the room to do more research on finding any weaknesses on the nations his nation waged war against. The scroll laid there on the floor, underneath where the dragon's head was mounted. If the man had not turned around and left, he would have noticed the rumbling of the dragon's jaw as it closed and its eyes giving a crimson glow within the darkness, lighting the room softly till they finally died and darkness consumed it all. Flashing of thunder and trembles of the earth, hurricane winds and the eruption of black and white flames were seen coming from the mouth of the valley as a fierce battle took place. Far from the distance of the battle, four figures were running at high speeds through the forest in hopes of catching with their comrade, only to stop just as a tremor shot across the lands and felt a rise of power. Across the distance, the four saw a crimson beam of light going upwards as if it was reaching towards the heavens. "His power sure is intimidating," muttered a young man with spiky brown hair, the symbol of fire sage etched in the back of his red robe as he stared at the beam of light. "Yea it is," whispered a young woman that has orange hair tied up with red elastics into two very large pigtails. Her robes were orange-brown with the symbol of air sage on her back. A teen with unfocused colorless eyes and short light brown hair adoring a golden-colored robe with the symbol of earth sage on his robe just nodded his head, worried for his master as he was fighting a powerful enemy that wished their destruction, and lastly a teen near him wearing a light blue robe with the symbol of water with black hair kept staring. Mesmerized at the power and strength that his teacher held, the crimson light show could be seen all over the elemental nations. "Konohamaru, Mogi, Yuden, let's go, the faster we get there, the faster we can help him," exclaimed the blue-robed teen as the rest of the teens just nodded their heads and they continued to rush towards the valley. Moments before the light beam shot through the sky, two giant statues stood beside the giant waterfall within the valley itself. The sounds of grunting and yelling echoed through the valley along the sounds metal clashing as two figures were fighting it out. A raven-haired teen with blood dripping from his mouth, the side of his head and eyes, wore a tattered and bloodied white long-sleeved shirt which was open at the torso, a family crest of a fan etched on his back, with black pants and a blue cloth hanging from halfway up his stomach to his knees. A purple rope belt around his waist, tied in a bow, his sword drawn as he swung to strike down his foe with vengeance with a loud yell as he brought his sword down towards his target. Die. The blonde teen wearing tattered loose white kung fu pants with black battle shoes, his upper body cut and bruised from battle, whisker-like marks adorning his cheeks, kept dodging left and right, ducking right underneath it as he evaded the slashes of the sword, but still kept getting cut in the process as the blade managed to reach his skin a few times. Then his enemy jumped in the air for an overhead slash with both hands on the hilt, but he quickly managed to intercept by extending his left arm forward, catching the downward strike by placing his hand on the wrists with an open palm, and stood his ground firm and fearless, getting in a horse stance as he reared his fist and shot it forward, turning his body as one unit. Moving his right leg in front of his left leg for a stronger strike, the fist finding its mark in his opponent's chest, sending the raven-haired teen back crashing onto the rocky terrain of the valley, causing a small avalanche as rocks landed on top of him. Watching the rubble of rocks falling down, the blonde warrior relaxed his guard a little as he couldn't feel any movement on the ground, but to relax a little was dangerous in a place of battle, as he soon learned as the raven-haired teen he had sent towards the rocks jumped out of the ground from behind, causing the blonde to turn around in surprise as the swordsman brought his sword down with the intent of cutting him in half, only to find the blonde to counter defense by blocking the oncoming sword strike with his black metal arm bracers on his forearms, using his physical strength to try and push the swordsman off of him, but was struggling as the raven-haired teen overpowered him and slowly brought the blade down towards the blonde's face. Seeing that the blade was getting closer and closer, he shifted his feet closer and fire began to sprout from the plant of his feet. Using his body, the elemental bender pushed off the blade and sent a rising flaming kick, aiming for the chin, but the swordsman saw what his opponent was trying to do and managed to jump away unharmed a few feet back. away from him as he landed on top of a small hill, glaring down at the blonde as he landed on the hill across from him, black onyx eyes glaring spitefully at ocean blue eyes. Surrender Sasuke, I don't wish to fight you in a pitiless battle, but I cannot allow you harm the people of the village, said the blonde teen as he stared passively at the teen now identified known as Sasuke. Sasuke began to chuckle, and slowly the laughter began to get louder and louder as he finally let out a madman's laughter, calming down with a crazed look in his eyes. You must be more delusional than I thought, Naruto, said the Uchiha as he sneered at Naruto, as said blonde narrowed his eyes at the raven-haired teen as he began to close his eyes. If you think I'm just going to turn myself in and take it laying down to what that forsaken village did to my clan and accept my fate. They wouldn't be nothing if weren't for the might of the Uchiha clan, finished the Uchiha darkly as he reopened his eyes and his eye color had changed to blood color eyes with intersecting eclipses. The blonde just stood quiet, knowing full well what the advisors of the village council and the Sandaime himself did by ordering the complete annihilation of the Uchiha clan at the hands of his older brother, Itachi Uchiha. Since they were planning a coup d'etat by trying to overthrow and kill the Sandaime Hokage, along with the clan heads that formed majority of the council, and take control of Konohagakure no Sado. You got your revenge when you killed Danzo, Koharu and Homura, there's no point for you to spill the lives of the innocent, retorted Naruto as he tried to reason with the ludicrous Uchiha. My revenge isn't complete since I didn't get kill the one who authorized it, but destroying the village of Konoha and her people should be an equivalent substitute for the genocide of my clan, was the Uchiha's crazed response as he gained a dark crazed look in his eyes, along with your wife and unborn child. Naruto narrowed his eyes dangerously at the Uchiha's threat, but he just took a deep breath and let out a sigh as he closed his eyes. I see, then you leave me with no other alternative, said Naruto as he began to concentrate on unleashing his real strength, affecting the forces of nature around him. As the air began to breeze rapidly, waves of water began to crash around the rocks of valley wildly as a large spider web crack appeared on the earth. An outline of red energy began to sprout out of Naruto's body, circulating him all over his persona as small tattoos began to appear on some parts of his upper body, barely visible to the naked eye. Sasuke was looking astonished as he finally gets to see the power that his former teammate had gained and used in order to defeat and kill his ancestor, Madara Uchiha, and ending the Fourth Great Ninja War, bringing glorious peace to the elemental nations. Not wanting for Naruto to get the upper hand by overpowering him, the Uchiha sprung into action by tearing into hand signs at blinding speed and took a deep breath as he finished the hand sign sequence on the tiger seal and shouted his technique. Pain. Ryuken no Jutsu. A stream of dark fire originated from his mouth as it rushed towards the powering blonde, hitting him dead on as the flames impacted and formed a giant tower of fire, engulfing him completely. Sasuke smirked with satisfaction as he thought that the blonde had been killed, since nothing on this world could have survived a direct hit from the intense heat of his flames that he had obtained after he achieved total control over the Amaterasu. But his smirk soon turned into a scowl as he saw that the blonde had survived as a beam of red light shot towards the skies, forcefully dispersing the pillar of fire as it revealed Naruto, his eyes still closed, unharmed and floating a good 15 feet of the ground as the tattoos had now become fully visible. The double-headed arrow on his chest with two small lines going downward on the sides of his pectorals, a circle on each shoulder with scoop underneath it, a spiral tattoo on each forearm, starting from his wrist to halfway up his forearm, all glowing a bright crimson. But his most noticeable tattoo of them all was the one on his back, 4 dragons of each element, fire, water, earth and wind. Glowing on his back, tangled with one another as if they were reaching for the heavens. The blonde's eyes that were closed had now shot open. Eyes that once had a nice shade of ocean blue were now portraying slitted eyes with redder eyes and spoke with a deeper, almost demonic voice. Sasuke Uchiha. You and your forefathers have disrupted the peace of this world for far too long. It's time that I rectify a mistake that your late brother committed when he spared you, stated Naruto as he landed on the ground and stood in the praying mantis stance, with his right leg forward as he leaned back all of his body weight into his left leg. Both elbows separated an inch away from the abdomen with the forearms placed forward with wrists bent upward, making the fingers point up, and waited for the Uchiha to make his move as he closed his eyes and used the vibration of the ground to see. You think you can kill me? Shouted Sasuke, enraged at the calmly tone that the blonde had said, as if he wasn't a threat to him. I'll show you dope, that no matter what power you possess or whose line you came from, you'll always be beneath me, and Uchiha. Thought the Uchiha sinisterly as he prepared to use his most powerful fire attack, blood dripping from the corner of his eyes as he summoned the dark flames of Amaterasu, forming an ember at the palm of his hands. Growing bigger and bigger till both hands were engulfed in flames. The blonde saw what the Uchiha was trying to do and changed his stance from the praying mantis to Taikai. As he began to do its forms, his body became relaxed and his breathing became controlled. Fluently motions he did with his hands as he waved them around in the air, causing the water within the valley to move towards him, circulating around him as he changed his tempo. But the breathing remained the same as he now began to move his whole upper body in a circular motion while moving his hands in the same rhythm. Gusts of wind began to pick up around him, surrounding him like a tornado as it mixed with the water, turning it to ice inside the air torrent, with the blonde standing in the middle of the razor ice typhoon, ready to permanently strike down the person that he once considered a brother. The unidentified teen along with the once Konohamaru Corps kept running at high speeds, the valley coming into view as they got closer and closer, feeling the winds getting stronger as they reached their destination, debris flying in their direction in the process. Inari. Konohamaru. "Look, we're close to the valley," shouted Mogi to her teammates while Yuden, having a better sense of feeling of the terrain, he felt large pieces of broken trees coming in their direction and yelled out a warning. "Incoming." Both Inari and Konohamaru looked up ahead and saw many broken trees were flying in their direction and noticed that one of the larger chunks of wood was about to hit them, but Mogi reacted by jumping into the air and passed between them, twisting her body in the air to deliver a spinning kick. Compressed air shot from her foot as she sent the broken pieces of trees and everything that came in their direction away from the two into the distance as the three landed in the ground panting a bit. "Thanks Mogi," said Konohamaru as Inari just nodded his head. Grinning a bit, she turned to her elemental brothers and decided to tease him a bit. "No problem Kono-chan. Don't call me that," whined Konohamaru as Inari and Yuden just chuckled a bit, but when Inari saw that most of the debris caused by Mogi blocked their path, he voiced his opinion. "Damn, we're going to have to around this and it'll take us longer to reach the valley," cursed Inari. "Leave it to me," replied Yuden as he stepped forward ahead of the group and firmly placed both his feet into the ground, placed both elbows a little bit away from his stomach and raised his hands with his palms open facing down to suddenly brought them down forward as if he was pushing a boulder, only to cause a giant dirt cloud to form as the earth parted, pushing all that blocked their path. Once the cloud cleared, a cleared path stood right in front of them. "Nice going Yuden, now let's go," ordered Konohamaru as they once again ran towards the valley. Back the valley, the battle was about to reach its climax as Sasuke reared his hands back as he crazily shouted at the blonde. "You're right. One of us is going to die Naruto, but it's not going to be me." Amaterasu shot both his hands forward, launching a giant stream of fire at the blonde. With a twist of his upper body, Naruto moved in a circle as he waved his hands in a circular motion, only to stop as he shot his right hand forward with an open palm, sending the typhoon straight into the flames. Both streams met head-on as they collided with one another, both fighters focused on overpowering each other's attack, but neither one getting the upper hand as they both continued to struggle. Naruto saw that the elements began to mix and knew that if this continued, their attacks would reach their breaking point and cause a giant explosion, most likely severely injure or kill both of them, but that was a risk he was willing to take. Twisting his foot a little, he ordered the earth to get a hold of Sasuke as the earth itself reached up and clamped into his legs, not giving him a chance to escape. "What?" shouted Sasuke in surprise as he looked down at his legs and saw he was being held in place. Naruto pushed even further, sending more currents of air into the fire, making the struggle of the elements to reach their max as it formed a giant sphere of energy, growing bigger and bigger by minute till it finally couldn't hold it anymore and began to glow a bright light till it exploded, engulfing Sasuke and Naruto in the process as they both stood firm on their ground. Or trapped in the Uchiha's case. The four sages finally reached their destination as they landed atop of the mouth of the valley, only to find a giant explosion in its wake. Yuden realizing the danger they were in, he jumped in front of the group and got into a solid horse stance, shot his forearms forward in a defensive position as he commanded the earth to build a giant wall in front of them, protecting them from destruction as Yuden began to sweat profusely by maintaining the wall from collapsing from the sheer force of the explosion. As the explosion occurred, Naruto bended the earth to build a massive shield, but at point blank, the force of the explosion was so great, it obliterated the wall and hit Naruto directly, injuring him severely as he was sent dashing through the boulders and into the water, slowly sinking into the depths. Using the last bit of his strength before he lost consciousness, the blonde clashed both of his fists together and caused a tornado to form underwater and tried to separate the water, but it backfired as the water itself began to freeze around him and due to his injuries, the blonde couldn't hold the tornado for long as he began to slip into consciousness. But before his world went black, one person was on his mind and let out a sad smile. "Forgive me 10-10, for I wasn't able to keep my promise," thought Naruto regretfully as he closed his eyes and finally lost consciousness within the ice pillar, putting his body in a hibernating healing state and his ice chamber slowly sinking into darkness of the lake. The shield that Yuden made slowly crumbled back to the ground as the four took a look at what remained of the valley. The statues that once portrayed the founders of Konoha were nothing more than just rubble as a few parts only remained. The giant crater was created where the explosion took place. The water was still held back by an unknown force till it finally came crashing down the crater, the waves roaring as it filled the gap on the ground. "Unbelievable," said an astonished Inari. "Yay, but where is he? I don't see him anywhere," said a concerned Mogi as she kept looking for their master as she walked a few steps forward. "Let's split up and look, we'll cover more ground this way," suggested Yuden as he looked at his friends who just nodded an affirmative at the idea, but before they began to mobilize, they all heard a groaning of pain coming from a couple of feet away from their location, a hand sprouting from the rubble as the person tried to dig himself out. "There he is. Naruto." Mogi shouted in relief as she rushed ahead with the three following behind her. Once she was in reach, she saw who it was that crawled out of the rocks and made a sudden stop as she stared in shock as to who it was, Konohamaru, Yuden and Inari catching up with her. "Mogi, what's wrong? Why you stop?" asked Inari as Yuden and Konohamaru saw her look in disbelief, turning to see what she was looking at that got her in this state, only to be surprised themselves as they saw that it was none other than Sasuke Uchiha. Uchiha growled Inari as he sprung forward and waved his hands upward, causing the water to crash into Sasuke against the wall, freezing him in place, leaving his head the only part of his body unfrozen, causing the Uchiha to cough blood on the ice due to his ribs being damaged even further. "Where is Naruto, you bastard?" demanded Konohamaru, only for Sasuke to chuckle darkly at the teens as he lifted his head up and looked directly into their eyes. "I killed him, he wasn't strong enough to defeat me," responded the Uchiha, causing the guys to growl dangerously as they held their anger, while Mogi held her hand atop of her mouth in shock. "You're lying," shouted Mogi with tears developing at the corner of her eyes. "Haha, am I now? Then pray tell why I'm the one still alive while your precious master is dead at the bottom of the lake," sneered Sasuke as he let a cold laughter only for Inari to get angered even more and silenced him by freezing him completely. Yuden raised his arm upward with his fingers pointing straight. Cutting the earth where the Uchiha was being held in place and letting it fall into the water where it began sink. Meanwhile Konohamaru held a crying Mogi as she mourned the loss of their friend, brother, and teacher. "Let's go, we have to report to Lady Tsunade," muttered a saddened Konohamaru as the two somberly nodded their heads while Mogi still cried in Konohamaru's chest, tears slowly falling out of their eyes as they bowed their heads in silent respect before they headed back to the village. Meanwhile, back in the hospital of Konohagakure no Sato, there was a big group of people in the waiting room as they patiently waited for news of their friend who was giving birth to the son of a certain knuckle-headed avatar who has yet to return with victory over the traitorous Uchiha, causing some to get worried. "Damn it. Where is that stupid blonde? He should be here to see his son being born," exclaimed a Chunin with spiky brown hair and black slitted eyes as he sat next to his companion, a giant wolf-like dog as he barked in agreement. "Mendakus, you know who that troublesome blonde is fighting against. Naruto cannot afford to take it lightly against him," a Jonin with a pineapple hairstyle reminded to his comrade. "But still Shikamaru, it has been almost 3 hours since we last felt that massive rise of chakra die out and saw that bright flash of light." A Jonin with smooth black hair and pale lavender eyes gave his 2 cents as he voiced his opinion, causing some of the rookie 9 to look down in concern, but a blonde young woman decided to speak. "Look, this is Naruto we're talking about. He's too stubborn to lose to Sasuke, much less to die and leave his family behind, so stop thinking like he's going to die and let us wait for his return. For right now 10-10 is our concern since she's still in the delivery room," said Ino as she turned her head back towards the doors of the delivery room. Inside the room was a woman with brown hair tied in 2 buns was lying in bed with her legs open, panting with sweat pouring down her face as she went into labor, taking deep breaths as instructed by the nurse delivering the baby. "You're doing great 10-10, just keep taking deep breaths and push, I can see the head coming," encouraged a fair-skinned lady with brown eyes. Her long, blonde hair tied into 2 ponytails except for her bangs, which are parted in the middle and fall down the sides of her face, her forehead adorned a violet rhombus. Her clothing consisting of a grey kimono-style blouse with no sleeves, held closed by a broad dark bluish-grey obi that matches her trousers. The blouse is closed quite low, as it revealed her sizable cleavage. A shoulder-length dark hair girl with bangs and dark eyes wearing a long bluish-black kimono with white trimmings, except for on the sleeves held closed by a wide obi, was monitoring 10-10 as she kept wiping the sweat of her face. "Keep pushing 10-10, the head is already out," stated Shizune as she saw that Tsunade was carefully pulling the baby out of the womb, while 10-10 still screamed in pain as she pushed. "I'm going to fucking castrate that bastard with a rusted knife as soon as I see that fucking blonde," screamed a hormonal 10-10, scaring Shizune a bit. "If Sasuke didn't kill him, I'm sure his wife will," thought Shizune, not knowing how true her thoughts were about the blonde's demise. The wails of a baby suddenly filled the room as Tsunade held a baby boy. Ten, with teary eyes, stared at her newborn son, happiness filling her whole being as she tried to reach for her baby. Tsunade slowly and carefully placed the baby in her mother's arms and watched tenderly as to how the mother brought the baby closely to her chest, silently crying in happiness as she held her baby. Then she looked towards Tsunade. "Lady Tsunade, has Naruto returned yet?" asked Ten hopefully, hoping that her husband was on the other side of the doors, waiting to come in and see his son. But was only disappointed when Tsunade just looked down and sadly shook her head. "Have you thought of a name for the baby yet, Ten?" asked a pink-haired nurse with green eyes, wearing the usual nurse uniform as she had helped Tsunade Shishio to deliver Naruto's baby, hoping to brighten the mood. Smiling softly, she looked at the little bundle of joy she held in her arms, the weapon mistress simply said, "Raisin." Suddenly, a glow began to emit from the baby, surprising everyone in the room as Ten held out her son, worried that something was happening to her baby, but to her shock and everyone else's, the glow came from the same shape of tattoos that his father had, minus the whisker marks on his cheeks. Till they finally stopped glowing and stayed visible for a few seconds till they had completely disappeared. "Looks like we have a second coming of the Gaki," joked the Hokage, as everyone else shared a laugh, except Ten, for she could not shake the feeling of dread that began to build up in her chest as she stared at her sleeping son and pulled him back to her chest, holding him tightly. "Please Naruto, be alright," thought the weapon mistress as she looked out the window. At the front of the gates, the four benders arrived solemnly as they still couldn't believe that the blonde was dead as they kept walking past the gates. The young Sarutobi stopped on his tracks, causing the rest to look at him, wondering what was going through his mind as he had been quiet all the way back to the village. "You guys head towards the Hokage tower, I'll gather the rookie 9 along with bro's wife and meet you guys back there," said Konohamaru as he disappeared in a whirl of flames, heading towards the hospital as he left the rest of his team to do as they were told, since there was nothing left to do. Appearing in front of the hospital, the young fire sage walked into the building and began to look around for Sakura, knowing well that she was in charge of the hospital in Tsunade's absence due to her Hokage duties, so she could help him gather everyone at the tower, but just as he made a turn, Konohamaru ran into Hanabi as she walked without paying attention and crashed into him, landing flat on her ass. "Watch where you're going, you idiot," ranted the young heiress, but stopped once she saw that it ran into Konohamaru. Jumping to her feet, she ran into his arms, hugging each other tightly for a second till they parted lightly from the hug. "When you got back, Kono-kun? I missed you," said the young Hyuga as she looked into his eyes, her happiness replaced with concern as she saw the sadness in his eyes. "What happened, Konohamaru?" whispered Hanabi as she placed her hand on his cheek. Konohamaru reached for her hand and gently gave it a squeeze, letting out a sigh. He looked at his girlfriend with tired eyes. "Hana-chan, do you know where I can find the Rocky 9? asked the young firebender, completely ignoring her question. Nodding her head slowly, she nudged with her head towards the delivery room down the hall. There in the delivery room, celebrating with Naruto-sama's wife and the newborn, was Hanabi's response as Konohamaru gained a surprised look in his face, thinking he heard wrong, thinking that Ten wasn't due till a couple more days. She already had the baby. Hanabi nodded her head, yes, she went into labor earlier than expected. She gave birth to a boy, looking like a mini Naruto, minus the whisker marks, and having his mother's hair color instead of blonde with darker shade of blue in his eyes, but the most shocking surprise of all was the glowing tattoos that looked identical to Naruto's, glowing light blue instead of crimson though. At this revelation, Konohamaru's eyes widened in shock, he didn't think it was possible for Naruto's power to be passed down through his kid. If Naruto's son gained his father's power then that means thought Konohamaru before he was brought out of his musing by Hanabi. "Konohamaru, what's going on?" asked Hanabi worriedly only to be grabbed on the shoulders by Konohamaru. "Hanabi, go to the Hokage tower and go get the rest of my team, tell them exactly what you said about bro's baby, K?" the fire sage said urgently, making the young heiress nod her head rapidly and dashed out of the hospital as soon as her boyfriend let go of her, heading straight to the tower. Leaving Konohamaru alone in the corridor as he began to walk towards the doors and stopping with his hand on the handle, not looking forward to the news he was about to bring. Taking a deep breath, the young Sarutobi walked inside. Everyone in the Rookie 9 was rejoicing and laughing as they celebrated and congratulated the weapon mistress. The girls ogling the baby as they each tried to hold him, squealing like little girls at the cuteness of the baby, while the guys just talked and claimed how he would grow strong and fearless like his father. Only to be interrupted as the doors were opened and saw the grandson of the Sandaime walking in, the feeling in the room began to slightly change as some were feeling uneasy. "Greetings Hokage-sama, I come to report to you on our mission, aiding Naruto Namikaze in his battle against Sasuke Uchiha," said Konohamaru as he kneeled down in front of everyone, but right in front of his leader, not daring to look up into the eyes of his late teacher's wife. Brief me later, Konohamaru, for right now that idiotic blonde needs to get his ass here and greet his son, said Tsunade dismissively as she waved her hand non-caringly, but Konohamaru wouldn't have any of it. I'm afraid that I must insist, for it is urgent, Konohamaru retorted back as he stood up and looked directly in the Gondaime's eyes. Seeing the seriousness of Naruto's pupil, Tsunade put her poker face on and crossed her arms under her massive breasts, glaring with intensity back into his eyes, demanding an explanation from him, only to be interrupted by someone. Konohamaru-kun, did Naruto return with you? Asked Tenten from her bed, as she looked at him with worried eyes. Yes, where is Naruto-kun? Konohamaru? A young woman that sat near Tenten on her bed. Long blue purplish hair with lavender eyes staring at him, her resemblance to his girlfriend being uncanny, only difference was she was older by a few years. Yosh. Naruto-kun should be here so he can shine his sun with his flames of youth. Screamed a guy in tight green jumpsuit and orange leg warmers, huge eyebrows with a bowl haircut as he pumped his fist into the air. Lee. No shouting in the hospital. Yelled Sakura as she bonked Lee in the head. But all fell to deaf ears as Konohamaru kept his silence, hesitating to answer, but kept still keeping his cool. A young man wearing his jacket hanging down to his knees, his hood obstructing his face adorning a satchel on his back, noticed the young bender's body tensing up and narrowed his eyes at him. There's something you're not telling us, said the hooded teen. I'll answer all of your questions, but first we must wait for the others to arrive, said the firebender firmly. Kiba was about to ask who he was referring to, but his answer was answered as a giant puff of smoke appeared in the room, revealing the rest of Konohamaru's teammates, wearing unreadable expressions as the smoke cleared, with Hanabi in tow. Alright brat, cut the bullshit, what hell is going on and where is Naruto, ordered Tsunade as her patience was running thin, tired of beating around the bush. Taking a deep breath, the young Sarutobi started to speak. Naruto is dead, killed by Sasuke Uchiha at the Valley of the End. And the whole room became deadly silent as Konohamaru dropped the bomb on them, the news slowly sinking in, shaking everyone to the very core, but his wife, taking it the hardest as she just sat there, shell-shocked in place with a stricken look in her face. No, 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 please tell me that it's not true. Please tell me he is just playing a sick joke on us. Pleaded Tenten as cried desperately, her tears dripped down her cheeks as she got out of the bed, despite that she had gone through labor almost few minutes ago and walked right up to Konohamaru, gripping him by the robe as she shook him back and forth. You better be lying, Sarutobi. Growled the Hokage menacingly as she released her killer intent at the fire user. Konohamaru, please. Tell me he isn't dead. Cried the weapon mistress only for the four of them to lower their heads in silent. It's true, Sasuke confirmed it when we confronted him, Mogi whispered softly as she closed her eyes. Falling to her knees, she cried in her hands as everyone watched in sorrow at the now widow. Tsunade sat in a chair in disbelief, her heart aching as she lost another member of her family, tears silently falling down as her body began to feel numb, staring into the wall. Shikamaru held Ino as she cried in his chest, along with Hinata as she cried in the arms of her cousin, Nichi. Hiba, Choji and Shino just sat quiet in the back of the room with their eyes shut, sobbing quietly as they mourned their fallen friend. Turning his attention back to the group, Shikamaru asked them a question that had everyone's attention. What happened to Sasuke? Inari was the one who responded, I froze him leaving his head free, to interrogate him what he had done to Naruto-sensei, but he gloated how he had killed him and froze him completely. Yuden crumbled the earth beneath him, sending him sinking into the depths of the valley. Konohamaru then kneeled down and placed his hands on her shoulders, making Tenten look into his eyes. Tenten, I have a request, started Konohamaru, I want to teach Naruto's son firebending when he comes of age. I want to give his son his legacy, he finished saying, shocking everyone in the room. I'll teach him waterbending, volunteered Inari. I'll teach him earthbending, Yuden said next as he stepped forward next to Yuden. And I'll teach airbending, Mogi said lastly as she stood in between Yuden and Inari. How do you know that he's going to be able to use all four styles? Naruto's power was unique, we don't know much about it, except that he got it after he merged his power with the Kyuubi's. Hell, we don't even know if the boy inherited the same power as well, exclaimed Shikamaru as he voiced out his opinions, but the answer to his questions were answered by the Hokage. Naruto's son did inherit his father's bloodline, for right after he was born, the same tattoos that appeared on Naruto's body when he used his power, appeared on the little brat's body, but only for few seconds till they disappeared, explained the busty Hokage. We believe that with Naruto's passing, the essence that resided in him was passed down to his son, making him the second avatar, stated Yuden as he crossed his arms across his chest and closed his eyes and stopped to gather his thoughts, but we also theorize that the essence will retain some knowledge of the person's previous life and also become a cycle itself. How do you figure this? Asked Niji, curious at the earthbender's theory. Naruto once told us that he felt the power he gained had a consciousness of itself, guiding him when he went into the avatar state, as he used the four elements without clashing with each other. As for the theory of becoming a cycle, take Naruto himself for example, his main element was wind as he mastered it faster out of the three, then water and earth, and lastly fire, having being the most difficult for him to master, explained Konohamaru this time, looking at the crowd in front of him. So you're saying that the cycle would start with wind, that being Naruto to his son, which would be what element? Kept asking Niji. The next element would be water, replied Yuden as he lowered his head, since it would make sense at the order that Naruto learned the elements. Everyone contemplated at what was being said, but still couldn't believe that the blonde was gone from their lives. Konohamaru, not seeing the baby, walked up to the crib and peered inside, finding the little baby fast asleep, as he softly snored and smiled sadly, thinking of how he would grow up without a father, just like Asuma's son. The rest of the benders walked up to the crib, seeing the newborn for the first time, could not help but smile at the innocence of the baby. Mogi reached with her hand and gently caressed the baby's cheek. "What's his name?" asked Mogi, looking into Tenten's direction as she looked up from the crib. Wiping her tears with hands, the weapon mistress replied. "His name is Raisin Namikaze." "Raisin, huh?" muttered a pensive Konohamaru as he kept staring at the baby. "I'm sorry for not making it on time to save your father, little one," thought Konohamaru as he placed his finger in the baby's hand, being grasped by the baby as he slept. "We both lost something. We lost a great man that was a friend, a brother, a husband, a mentor and a leader, but I promise you, I'll train to be the man that your father would be proud of. Naruto may be gone, but he won't be forgotten as a piece of him lives within you," thought Inari as he looked over Konohamaru's shoulder, "guiding you as you grow." Mogi reached into the crib and gently picked up little Raisin into her arms, cuddling it close to her chest. Yuden stood on her right as he placed an arm around her, reaching with his fingertips to feel the features of the baby. On her left, Nohamaru stood while Inari was standing right beside Yuden, the four of them staring at the baby, and said infant began to slowly open his eyes, a soft glow emitting in them. The view slowly began to drift from the men out the window as it rose over the village and into the skies. The cycle of time passing by as day became night and night became day. The seasons coming and going as the terrain changed with time and the age of the shinobi began to slowly die, since they were no longer needed in times of peace, as the Avatar maintained the balance within the four nations. The elemental nations went through drastic changes as the disciples of the Crimson Avatar taught the ways of bending to the people, forming new ways of life that would last through the centuries. The 5 main villages would be divided, and in their place 4 nations named after the element they were taught would take their place. The Earth Nation residing in the east taking a vast majority of land, the Fire Nation located at the western volcanic islands of the oceans, the Waterbenders went their separate routes as some went north and south, thus creating the northern and southern tribes. The Airbenders migrated into the 3 highest mountains of the world, creating their civilization detached from the rest of the world. Everyone was enjoying the peace and harmony they have had for the past 10,000 years, and as they lived in prosperity, but sadly, everything doesn't last forever as war was rising at the horizon. History was about to be made that would shock the nations to their foundation in the years to come, and this, my friends, is where the tale truly begins. The view fast forwards into distance as it reached the place where the Valley of the End was once located, but instead of what was left over of the 2 statues that stood aside of the waterfall, a large body of water had overflown the valley through the years as an island floated on top of the ocean. 2 volcanoes erupting as the smoke coming from the volcano's mouth covered the skies in a big shroud, ashes falling as it were black snow. One man was fighting against nature itself, his long white hair sticking to his aged face and forehead with sweat as he bended earth, fire and wind to calm the raging volcano, but he was unsuccessful and closed his eyes in anger at his failure. "Need a hand, old friend?" The old man turned behind him to see who had arrived and was surprised to see that it was his former best friend, Fire Lord himself. "Sazan!" exclaimed the old man surprised. "We have no time to waste, Roku," exclaimed the Fire Lord as he got off his dragon and joined his former friend in the attempt to calm down the volcano. Both stepped closer at the mouth of the volcano as the lava was pouring out like a geyser. Roku placed both his hands together as he closed his eyes and slowly brought them down as he exhaled his breath, pushing the lava down into the volcano, while Sazan extended his hand towards the river of molten rock and extracted the heat from the lava as he expelled it through his other hand. Successfully calming it down somewhat till it erupted again with more force, making the ground underneath the Fire Lord collapse and would have fallen to his demise if it hadn't been for Avatar Roku, saving him as he extended his arm outward, bending the earth to make a small platform underneath Sazan, and nodded his thanks at Roku. The volcano erupted even stronger as the ground trembled, parting the ground its wake, and the two began to run for safety. A short distance away from the island that Avatar Roku lived in, deep under the water, an underwater rock slide was occurring as the ground continued to part. A giant boulder fell from its place, revealing an undamaged giant pillar of ice resting in captivity, its spines beginning to crack as the tremors kept getting stronger and stronger till the pillar was finally free and began to float away to the surface. "Don't breathe the toxic gases," shouted Roku as he bended the air to blow away the air toxins, but the ground cracked underneath him and the poisonous gas shot into his face as he took a deep breath. Coughing and feeling noxious, Avatar Roku fell to one knee as he began to cough, and with his vision going blurry, he reached out for Sazin. "Please." Sazin coughed Roku as he still held out his hand as he begged the Fire Lord for his help, and Sazin just stood there, staring back at the Avatar passively, till out of the blue, Sazin shot his fist forward and a flare of dark flames shot out of his fist, nailing the Avatar right in the chest, fatally wounding him as he was sent flying backwards, landing with a loud thud on the ground. The shocked Roku slowly sat up and held his chest, trying to put down the black flames that still burned his flesh, and was shocked to see the flames didn't disperse. Staring in shock at the betrayal of his former friend, the Avatar glared hatefully at the Fire Lord as the wound and the poisonous gas finally beginning to take its toll on his body. "Why, Sazin?" muttered the Avatar as he stared at his former friend, but Sazin's appearance began to change. Roku thought that the toxins had affected his sense of sight, but this was proved wrong as the change of features was complete and in Sazin's place a raven-haired guy that looked to be in his early 20s stood there. His eyes crimson as the blood itself with a dark ring around the iris and 3 tomos on each eye, his face stone passive as he glared at the Avatar. "You're not Sazin. Who are you and what have you done to him?" shouted Roku as he glared hatefully at the person in front of him. "Sazin has been dead for the past 60 years, I killed him after you had left on your journey to master the remaining elements. The prince found me frozen at a cave near the beach and freed me, helped me regain my strength as he told me the history of the world. Seeing the new possibilities of this age, I advised him to use his might to conquer the other nations, since it was the most powerful of the 4, but the fool refused and turned against me and challenged me, believing he could defeat me, so I killed him and took his place in the throne," confirmed the impostor. "It wasn't hard, due to the fact that the ancient art seemed to be forgotten. And placing an illusion over myself to make me look like Sazin wasn't much of a challenge. I had hoped on your return that you would not make the same foolish mistake your friend made, but yet again, I was proved wrong as you opposed me, defeating me without effort despite my power, but that was my mistake since I underestimated you, for you're not just the Avatar, but a direct descendant of him and his bastard offspring as well," finished the raven-haired man with a snarl as he glared hatefully at Roku. "But with you gone, all my plans are going to be realized. I have a vision for the future, Roku, with me being its sole ruler," finished the raven-haired impostor as his dragon landed behind him, waiting for his master to mount him. Mounting the dragon, the red-eyed impostor stared passively at Roku and flew out of the island in haste, without turning back. Back at the island, Roku kept glaring into the distance where Sazin's dragon flew, coughing and holding his chest in pain as he kneeled on the ground. Fang, the Avatar's dragon, saw his master being in danger as the avalanche came crashing down the island. The dragon flew down towards Roku and wrapped himself around him, the avalanche engulfing both of them into their death, along with the rest of the deserted village, as the volcano continued to erupt. Far away, the ice pillar had emerged, floating away into the South Pole, with the view of the lava gushing out of the volcano at a distance, unknowingly to await another century, in order to finally awaken. Meanwhile, at the Southern Air Temple, a little baby boy with brown hair was brought to the world, the mother smiling tenderly at her child. Not knowing of the fate that was set for the air nomads and the destiny that awaited each child, they continued to celebrate, only for said child to disappear 12 years later in the world's desperate time of need, and to reappear in a world of chaos 100 years later. 40 years had passed since the war first began, and the land in the South Pole hadn't changed since. A squad of waterbenders was scouting the seas, looking for Fire Nation warships that dared to intrude and threaten their home, for it's not wise to be unguarded in times of war, especially since the Fire Nation soldiers were persistent of eradicating every waterbender in the South Pole. "The area looks clear, let's head home," shouted the leader of the squad to his squadron as he turned towards them, but just as he turned, he saw a black shadow underneath the ice. Curious as to what was inside, he ordered his men to stop. "Halt, I think we found something," said the leader, bending the water towards the iceberg. As soon as the boat hit shore, the leader stepped out and walked to the shadow. Not being able to see anything due to the snow that covered it, the man used his hand to wipe the snow away, giving him a clear view of the being that was inside, and to his shock, he found a man trapped within. "What is the hell?" said the leader in shock. The view slowly peers into the iceberg, deep inside the pillar, as it indeed revealed a man frozen inside the ice, having blonde hair with black bracers and tattered clothing. For 100 years, the war that Fire Lord Sazin had started, waged on, with the catastrophes being high, and the entire balance between the nations was destroyed when the Fire Lord ordered the eradication of the air nomads in order to stop the rebirth cycle of the Avatar. But the Avatar had fled the temples before the Fire Nation launched their attack without his knowing and disappeared from the face of the world, only to finally wake up once again. The view goes around in the sky, passing through the clouds as it finally cleared and showed on top of the Arctic waters of the South Pole. A small boat could be seen slowly drifting on the sea between the glaciers, and inside the small boat were two teenagers. One boy with tan skin, blue eyes, shaved head save for a strip of brown hair pulled back in a small ponytail, and his companion was a girl, who also with tan skin, blue eyes, and brown hair. Whole some of her hair was pulled into a bun, as the rest was braided into a ponytail beneath it. Both were wearing thick blue fur clothes to protect them from the freezing winds. The boy held a spear as he hungrily eyed the fish that swam by. "It's not getting away from me this time," he said greedily. "Watch and learn, Katara," he said to the girl. "This is how you catch a fish." Katara threw him a skeptical look, then looked down and spotted another fish. Taking off her glove, she raised her hand and began to wave her hand, causing a globe of water holding the fish to rise out of the water. "Sokka, look," she called out excitedly. "Shh, Katara, you're gonna scare him away," he whispered, not taking his eyes off the fish. He licked his lips. I already smell him cooking." "But Sokka, I caught one," she continued to move the globe through the air. Just as Sokka reared the spear back going for the strike, he didn't notice the water globe behind him, and with his spear, he stick it into the globe, popping it like a balloon, splashing all over as he cried out, and the fish jumped back into the sea. "Hey!" Katara yelled as she glared at Sokka. Growling, he turned and glared at his sister. "Why is that every time you play with magic water I get soaked?" Katara sighed tiredly as she once again had to argue with her brother. "It's not magic. It's waterbending and it's..." Yeah, an ancient art unique to our culture, blah, blah, blah," Sokka recited annoyingly. "You've only told like 1,000 times," thought in his mind. "Look, I'm just saying that if I had weird powers, I'd keep my weirdness to myself. You're just as weird as that giant chunk of ice that has been in the middle of the village for Lord knows how many years." Katara raised an eyebrow. "You're calling me weird? I'm not the one who makes muscles at myself every time I see my reflection," smirking as her point was proven, since Sokka was doing it right now. Realizing that Katara had proven her point, Sokka stopped his flexing and glared at her. Then suddenly, the boat began to shake as it was picked up by a fast current. Grabbing the paddle, Sokka started paddling to keep from crashing into ice chunks, while his sister screamed. "Watch out!" Katara yelled as she noticed two chunks of ice were headed their way in a collision course, making both of them get scared, for if the boat got caught between them, it would be crushed along with them. Go left, she cried. Then the boat rammed into several ice chunks before ultimately getting crushed by the ice as they were forced out of the boat and onto a platform chunk of ice. Both looked up and looked around, realizing that they were stranded. "You call that left?" deadpanned Katara, looking at her brother. "You don't like my steering? Well, maybe you should have water-bended us out of the ice," Sokka said as he sat up, making a water-bending motion. Katara stood up. "So it's my fault," she said while her eyebrow was twitching annoyingly. "I knew I should have left you home. Leave it to a girl to mess things up," scoffed Sokka as he crossed his arms. Katara glared at him angrily. "You are the most sexist. Immature. Nut-brained," she yelled, flailing her arms around wildly, unconsciously bending the water behind her. "I'm embarrassed to be related to you." Causing the iceberg behind her beginning to crack and break to pieces with her anger, while Sokka kept staring wide-eyed. "Ever since Mom died, I've been doing all the work around camp while you've been off playing soldier." Katara, Sokka said meekly as he put his dot. "I even wash all the clothes. Have you even smelled your dirty socks? Let me tell you. Not pleasant." The iceberg cracked further as she continued to make angry faces. "Katara. Settle down," said Sokka as he tried to calm his sister down. "No. That's it. I'm done helping you. From now on you're on your own." And finally, the iceberg broke completely, catching Katara's attention as she turned. As it collapsed, it created large waves that pushed them back even further. "Okay, you've gone from weird to freakish, Katara," deadpanned Sokka. "You mean I did that?" asked a surprised Katara. "Yep, congratulations," said the warrior wannabe as he put his hand on her shoulder, but a blue light suddenly appeared from underneath and caught their attention. The water bubbled as it got bigger as the light kept glowing brighter and brighter until the light burst out of the water, turning out to be a giant glowing iceberg as it floated on the water with two shadows stuck inside the ice. Katara looked closely at the iceberg and saw two figures, one big and one small. She raised an eyebrow in curiosity. "What the heck?" she thought. A smaller shape opened its glowing eyes, shocking the two teens. "He's alive, we have to help him," Katara exclaimed as she snatched Sokka's club and headed toward the iceberg. "Katara, get back here," Sokka ordered. "We don't know what that thing is." He grabbed his spear and chased after his sister. By the time he got there, Katara was already clubbing the iceberg with all her might as she swung 2 times and a small crack began to form. With one last mighty swing and managed to break through, releasing a burst of air that blew them back. The crack began to course around the iceberg right through the middle, before finally burst with a blue light shot up into the sky. Tiger seals roared in fright but stopped after a big boom. The light shot into what looked like a big hole in the sky, where the same colored light circled down around the beam and crashed into the iceberg. However, Katara, Sokka, and the tiger seals weren't the only ones to see the light. A metal boat not too far away with a flag of fire was sailing through the icebergs, and in it, a teenage boy in red and black armor stared at the light in slight awe before his golden eyes began to narrow, glaring at it. "Finally," he said. His head was mostly shaved, just a small patch of hair where a ponytail grew out of it, but his most noticeable feature however was the scar covering his left eye to his ear, as his eye could barely open due to the massive scar. "Uncle, do you realize what this means?" the boy said to an old man wearing red robes and armor. "I won't get to finish my game," the man responded. "It means," the boy ignored the remark, "my search is about to come to an end." The old man sighed while rubbing his eyes and just shook his head. "Here we go again," he thought. "That light came from an incredibly powerful source, Uncle." "It has to be him," retorted the scarred firebender to the old man, "or it's just the celestial lights. We've been down this road before, Prince Zuko. I don't want you to get too excited over nothing again," Zuko's uncle said as he continued playing his game of cards. "Now come and sit, why don't you have a nice cup of calming jasmine tea?" "I don't need any freaking calming tea. I need to capture the Avatar," Zuko exclaimed angrily and then turned towards the tower of the ship. "Helmsman, head a course to the light." Iroh sighed and placed an air card over another air card as a gentle breeze swept through the ship. The steam had finally cleared, allowing the siblings to see the broken part of the iceberg. As they looked at each other then back to the iceberg, Sokka raised his spear as if waiting for something or someone to suddenly come out and attack them, but he didn't have to wait long for a young boy with a glowing arrow on his head rose out the iceberg. Raising his spear higher, pointing at the kid, he yelled, "Stop." The kid stood fully up looking very intimidating as he based his eyes at the two. The glow slowly disappeared and Baldy collapsed onto the ground, heading head first, but luckily, Katara was able to catch him before he hit the ground and gently held him in her arms. Sokka scooted near the kid that lay on his sister's arms and began to poke him on the head with his spear. Katara, getting annoyed with her brother's antics, swatted the spear away as she glared at him. "Stop it," Katara told her brother before she gently laid him down on the snow. The bald one slowly started to awaken. Opening his storm gray eyes and groggily looked at Katara before gasping softly. "Beautiful," he thought. "I need to ask you something," he said weakly. "What?" "Please come closer." "What is it?" "Would you go penguin sledding with me?" he asked excitedly as his eyes went wide open. Katara raised an eyebrow at his sudden burst of energy, not sure of what to do or say. Sure, I guess." While his sister was occupied talking to the newfound stranger, Sokka was studying him. The kid was bald with an arrow going from his forehead and down his neck to most likely his back, arms and legs. His attire consisted of yellow clothing, Earth Kingdom, thought Sokka, but the lack of green clothing told him that wasn't the case and made him scratch that theory out, orange and yellow. Why does that sound familiar? Finished his thoughts as he started to scratch his chin as he watched a bald kid float to his feet, causing Sokka to jump back in surprise, with his mouth open and spear in front. "What's going on here?" asked the kid. "You tell us. How did you get in the ice? And why aren't you frozen?" demanded Sokka as he began poking him with his spear, but the kid swatted his spear away as he looked around. A deep growl startled both Sokka and Katara, but Baldy just climbed back into the glacier and jumped down to land on a giant ball of white fur. "Appa? Are you alright? Wake up, buddy," said Baldy as he lifted the creature's eyelid. But got no response, so he tried waking it up by trying to lift his face. The siblings came around the corner of the iceberg and saw the kid messing with the creature and gasped when the furry animal licked the kid, raising him from the ground as he laughed. "You're okay," said Baldy as he hugged the snout. "What is that?" asked Sokka. "This is Appa, my flying bison," replied the kid as he turned around, but Sokka just had a deadpan look in his face, clearly not believing him. "Right, and this is Katara, my flying sister," said Sokka sarcastically as he pointed with his thumb towards the girl next to him. The bison suddenly started make faces as his nose started to itch and sneezed hard as green snot shot out of his nose. The kid managed to dodge just in time as he ducked, but Sokka wasn't as fortunate as he got covered in mucus and stood there grimacing as he rolled on the ground, trying to scrub off the snot off of him here and his face through the snow. "Don't worry, it'll wash off," said the kid to Sokka as he pulled his hand away from his face, filled with snot, while Katara covered her mouth with her hand as she giggled. "Gross," was all he said. "So do you guys live around here?" the bald boy asked. Suddenly, Katara's brother jumped in between them with his spear pointed at him menacingly. "Don't answer that. Did you see that crazy beam of light? He was probably trying to signal the Fire Nation," said Sokka as he eyed the kid cautiously. Further annoyed with her brother's stupidity, she just rolled her eyes as she pushed her brother back. "Oh yeah, he's a Fire Nation spy. You can tell by his appearance and the evil look in his eyes," said Katara as she gestured toward the kid, and Baldy just grinned innocently, while the blonde tilted his head, eyes squinted, causing Sokka's eyebrow to twitch. "The paranoid one is my brother Sokka, you never told us your name." "I'm you." But before he could properly introduce himself, the bald kid sneezed, blowing a small cloud of snow as he flew into the sky, landing softly into the ground as he sniffed. "I'm Aang." "You just sneezed and flew 10 feet in the air," Sokka stated incredulously as he lazily pointed at Aang. "Really? It felt higher than that." Katara gasped, eyes squinted in surprise. "You're an airbender?" "Sure am," grinned Aang. "Giant light beams flying bison airbenders think I've got midnight sun madness. I'm going home where things make sense." He turned around and realized that there was no way off the iceberg as he stupidly glazed into the distance. "Well, if you guys are stuck, Appa and I can give you a lift." Aang airbent himself onto Appa's head. "We'd love a ride, thanks," Katara bowed. "Oh no, I am not getting on that fluffy snot monster," Sokka protested. "Are you hoping some other kind of monster will come along and give you a ride? You know, before you freeze to death," said the waterbender in training to Sokka, but before he started to say something, he suddenly stopped for he had no argument and gave up, stubbornly climbed on top of the bison. Crossing his arms in annoyance while Katara seemed excited. "Okay. First time flyers, hold on tight." Aang called. "Appa, yip yip." Appa flapped his tail and jumped into the air, and only to lazily jump into the water and started to swim. "Wow, that was truly amazing," Sokka says full of sarcasm, rolling his eyes. "Appa's just tired. A little rest and he'll be soaring through the sky." Aang made a soaring motion with his head. "You'll see," he smiled back at them, particularly at Katara, staring at her brown hair, tanned skin, and ocean blue eyes. "Why are you smiling at me like that?" she asked, noticing his stare. "Oh, I was smiling," Aang asked, trying to play it off, making Sokka groan, while Katara turned around and glared at her brother. They swam for a while till it finally turned dusk and everyone had gone to sleep as they rest till they had reached the tribe. Dreamscape. Everything was grey and pale browns. Thunder clashed as Aang woke up on top of Appa, struggling against Appa's reins as the heavy rain crashing down. "Ah!" Down they plummeted into the raging water as Aang screamed. They come up briefly for air, Appa groans as he struggled to get out of the water, but they are once again driven under the waver by the massive waves caused by the storm. As they drift downward, Aang drops Appa's reins and begins to lose consciousness. Suddenly, Aang's eyes and markings glow wide and puts his hands together and the water around him and Appa starts to freeze. Then dreamscape. "Aang. Aang, wake up." Katara's voice sounds. "Come on, get ready. We're in the village and everyone wants to meet you too," said Katara as she was about to walk out of the tent but stopped as she looked at Aang. While pulling on his clothes, Katara looked at his tattoos running almost all over his body, from the arms and head down his back and legs. Getting impatient, she grabbed Aang's hand and dragged him out of the tent and into the middle of the tribe. A group of people waiting for them outside of the tent, standing in front of a giant column of ice, standing in front of the group that mostly consisting of women and children. "Aang, this is the village, entire village, Aang," Katara introduced him to the village, while Aang simply bowed, but the villagers backed away a bit in small fright as the children scooted close to their mothers as they hugged their children close. Leaning closer to Katara, he whispered, "Why are they looking at me like that? Did Appa sneeze on me?" As he looked around himself to see find any snot. An old woman stepped up from the group. "No, young one, we're just surprised, for no one has seen an airbender in 100 years. We thought they were extinct until my granddaughter and grandson found you." "Extinct?" Aang asked in surprise as he thought. "Extinct? What's she talking about?" Feeling a nudge at the back of his head, Aang looked around to see where it was coming from, but couldn't point it out. Then he looked up behind the group, staring curiously and intensely at the ice pillar, and the feeling began to feel stronger, as if something was calling out to him, as his eyes started to glaze. Nobody noticed it, but a small luminous glow of red appeared within the ice, giving a soft hum that only the bald kid could hear. Suddenly, he was snapped out of his trance as Katara had placed her hand on his shoulder, turning his direction back to the elderly woman. "This is my grandmother," Katara introduced the old woman. "Call me Gran, she simply said. "What's with giant boulder of ice that's standing right in the middle of the village?" Suddenly asked Aang without taking his eyes away from the pillar, surprising the elderly woman completely. "This tower of ice was brought to the Souther tribe about 60 or so years ago when I was just a child. Inside resides a man that is to be believed to be quite old like yourself, if not older, but despite the efforts of the waterbenders that used to live here, the ice could not be destroyed or turned to water, as if unconsciously, the man inside was the one maintaining it together," said Kana as she turned back towards the pillar, continuing her story. "We believe that only the Avatar himself had the sufficient power in order to break the ice, but unfortunately, he disappeared a century ago with the rest of the air nomads," finished the elder as she sighed, closing her eyes, nobody noticing Aang flinching at the mention of the Avatar. "Has anyone been able to find out who exactly is frozen inside?" Aang continued to ask, as he now turned his attention from the tower to the old woman. Shaking her head slowly, she replied, "No, we haven't, but before the Fire Nation raided our tribe, the captain that found the iceberg theorized that the person inside the ice was the one that started the cycle and brought bending to the world due to the strange and glowing crimson patterns he described according to legend." "Wait, what legend? And by what you mean the one who started the cycle?" asked a now confused Aang, scratching his head. "She refers to the legend of the Crimson Avatar," clarified Katara, "also known as the Avatar of Four Dragons." "Crimson Avatar? Never heard of him," exclaimed Aang. "I'm not surprised, young one, the Avatar of Four Dragons is to be believed just a myth, an old tale passed down through the ages to tell the young ones. No one believes that he actually existed, for there aren't any records about him, and if there were, then most likely they were lost through time," explained Gran, with everyone listening intensely to every word their elder said. The loud of the blue, Sokka snatched Aang's staff out his hand, distracting everyone out of their stupor as he inspected the staff. "What is this? A weapon? You can't stab anything with this." Aang used airbending to suck the staff of his hands and right back to him. "It's not used for stabbing. It's for airbending," he explained as he slammed the butt of the staff onto the ground. Orange fan-like wings popped out. "Magic trick. Do it again." A little girl clapped. "Not magic, airbending," Aang corrected. "It lets me control the air currents around my glider and fly." Sokka snorted and crossed his arms. "Last time I checked, humans can't fly." Aang smirked. "Check again," and he shot up into the sky. Sailing through the air, doing as he did twists and turns, loops and spins, much to the awe of the villagers. Aang being distracted by all the attention he was getting from the villagers, he failed to see the snow tower ahead as he crashed into it seconds later, getting his head stocked on the tower, trying to free himself as he tried to pull himself out. But only to fall out and collapsing onto the ground with the tower now leaning to the side. "My watchtower?" Sokka cried. Katara walked towards Aang as he was somewhat buried in ice and helped him up. "That was amazing," she said while Sokka was mourning his tower. "Great. He's an airbender, Katara's a waterbender, and together you can just waste time all day long," grumbled Sokka as he sulked. "You're a waterbender?" Aang exclaimed excitedly as he turned to Katara, but they were interrupted by the siblings' grandmother. "Alright, no more playing, Katara, you have chores," Gran interjected, causing Katara to sigh and walk away with her grandmother. "I can't believe it, Gran. I finally found a bender to teach me," said Katara with excitement. "Katara, don't put all of your hopes in that boy," was Gran's reply as she held her hands behind her. "But Aang's special, I can tell. I can sense he's full of wisdom," countered Katara as she made an optimistic face. But as soon as they looked over at Aang, with his tongue stuck to his staff due to the ice, they sweat dropped. "Stee. Now my tongue is stuck to my staff," said the airbender, only to have one child of the group to pull the staff, causing Aang to grimace a little and making the children start to laugh. Back at the Fire Nation ship as they continued on its way deeper into southern Water Tribe waters, as the sun began to set, its orange-red colors illuminating the skies. Zuko faced off against two of his firebending crew members on deck, while Iroh sat nearby, observing from a distance. "Again," he says sternly, watching Zuko shot blasts of fire at them which they ducked under with ease. One retaliated with his own blast that Zuko ducked under, then backflipped over a blast from the other soldier. While in midair, Zuko punched and kicked blasts of fire at both of them, but they blocked it as he landed, facing his opponents. Iroh sighed. "No. Power in firebending comes from the breath, not the muscles. The breath becomes energy in the body, the energy extends past your limbs and becomes fire." He shot a fire blast that stopped short of Zuko's face. "Get it right this time." "Enough. I've been drilling this set all day. Teach me the next set, I'm more than ready." "No. You're impatient. You haven't even mastered the basics yet. Drill it again," said Iroh harshly as he narrowed his eyes at his stubborn nephew. Zuko growled and turned with a spinning kick, blasting fire from his foot, hitting his target. Despite the efforts of his sparring partner made in order to block it, the sages tell us that the Avatar is the last airbender. He must be over 100 years old, he's had a century to master the elements. I'll need more than basic firebending to defeat him. Exclaimed Zuko, only causing to Iroh frown. You will teach me the advanced set? Demanded the banished prince. Iroh hardened his eyes and took a deep sigh before he replied relentlessly, fine, but first I must finish my roast duck. Said the general as he pulled out a bowl and began eating happily. Zuko grimaced as he saw his uncle pigging out. How did he go from strict master to disgusting slob? Thought Zuko as he slammed his forehead on his palm. Night time. Aang and Katara were inside a tent, getting ready to go to bed talking about today's events, and curious still, Aang asked her a question that has been on his mind. Katara. Yes, Aang. How is it that you know much about him, the Crimson Avatar I mean? The question caught her a little off guard, her shoulders slumping down in sadness. My mother used to tell me the story when I was a little girl, telling me how he single-handedly stopped the war and brought peace to the lands many centuries ago, only mysteriously disappear without as much a trace. Paused Katara as she wiped a lone tear that appeared on her eye, as she remembered fondly when her mother would tuck her in bed and tell her the story. I'm sorry to bring painful memories, mumbled Aang, noticing the sadness in her voice. It's okay Aang, said the waterbender in training, smiling softly at him, let's get some rest, K. Aang just nodded his head as he jumped into the bed and sleepily he yawned, closing his eyes. Night Katara. Night Aang, replied Katara as she walked out of the tent. Later that night, Aang laid on his bed, restless as he could not shake off the feeling he felt when stared at the pillar, and somehow, it felt familiar, but he could not place a finger on it. Why does its presence feel so familiar? Wondered Aang in his thoughts as he laid his head on his arms, but decided to find out on his own accord as he got up from his bed and got dressed and walked out of his tent, standing right outside his tent with his sights right on the pillar. As he started to walk down to the middle of the tribe, he couldn't help but notice how massive it was, stopping suddenly as he was now standing in front of the beam of ice. What are you? Muttered Aang as he once again looked up at the center of the pillar, and the same humming sound he heard earlier came back, his eyes glazing as if he were hypnotized and slowly brought his hand up and placed it on the pillar and slowly closed his eyes. Unknowingly to Aang, Katara's grandmother, Gran, was watching the young airbender with curiosity as he headed towards the center of the village, eyeing him as he just stared up above and softly placing his hand onto the ice, and at first, nothing happened, but to her shock, a soft crimson glow began to emit from within the ice, and at the same time, Aang's arrows began to glow softly as well, illuminating the village lightly along with the aurora that hovered with the night for a few minutes, till it finally stopped, and Aang, quietly, went back to his tent. So the Avatar has returned to us, thought Kanna in shock, looking in the direction the airbender went, but then shifted her sights back to the pillar. But what is it that makes you special to gain the Avatar's attention? It was early morning of the next day, and Sokka was having a meeting with his soldiers training as to what to do when facing a firebender. Now men, it's important to show no fear when facing a firebender. In the water tribe, we fight till the last man standing, for without courage, how can we call ourselves men? Said Sokka as he walked side to side, and once he finished, he turned to his soldiers, his 6-year-old soldiers. I gotta go pee. One boy announced, raising his hand. Listen. Until your fathers return from the war, they're counting on you to be the men of the tribe, so no potty breaks. Exclaimed Sokka. But I really have to go. The boy protested, holding it in really bad. Sokka sighed. Okay. Who else has to go? And all the kids raised their hands. Sokka slapped his forehead in frustration while thinking we're doomed. Have you seen Aang? Katara asked. Gran said he disappeared over an hour ago. Aang crawled out a small igloo. Wow. You can freeze anything in there. Sokka groaned. Katara, get him out of here. This lesson is for warriors only. The children were using Appa's tail as a slide and landed on in a pile of snow, aggravating Sokka even further. Stop. Stop it now. Sokka glared angrily at the outsider. What's wrong with you? We don't have time for fun and games with a war going on. Or? Asked Aang while he hopped down from Appa. What are you talking about? You're kidding, right? Deadpanned Sokka. Then Aang looked behind Sokka and exclaimed, Penguin. Said Penguin jumped in surprise and waddled away with Aang zooming after it using airbending. The siblings stared at where they ran off to. He's kidding, right? After Aang had gone to chase the penguin, Katara had ran after him, trying to get him to teach her waterbending, despite knowing that he could only bend air. Deciding to give him a break, Katara showed him the way of catching a penguin by throwing him a fish and getting swarmed by them, and they slid across the snowy fields laughing along the way. Till finally they reached an abandoned Fire Nation warship, stacked up in ice by the former waterbenders of the tribe. Katara explained to him as to how it was one of the first attacks made by the Fire Nation when her grandmother was nothing but a child and how it had become painful memory to the people of her tribe and to herself, for it reminded them of what they lost and how the Fire Nation took her mother away from her and her brother. Aang, either by curiosity or stupidity, he walked near towards the ship, ignoring the cries of Katara of staying away. The airbender manages to convince her to come inside and the two begin talk. Aang, believing the talk of war on the four nations being false, denies it as he tells Katara that he had friends all over the nations, including the Fire Nation. But reality hit him hard as Katara made him realize that he had been frozen for not just a few years, but for an entire century. Saddened at the time he had been suspended, Aang sits against the wall, with his friend telling him everything was going to be okay. But fate had other plans, for as soon as they were about to leave, Aang had accidentally stepped into a booby trap and a gate closed the entrance of the ship, trapping them inside as a flare had shot up into the sky, exploding as it illuminated the area. The whole village saw the flare and knew it meant danger, for a fire ship could have seen the flare and come into their direction. Not far away, Prince Zuko saw the flare and using his telescope, he saw the Avatar escaping the ship, heading to the nearest village on the west and headed straight for course. Katara was worried that the whole village had seen the flare, and when they saw the village ahead, sure enough all the villagers were standing outside the village awaiting for them. As soon as they approached the entrance of the village, most of the children ran out and gathered around Aang, but one person wasn't happy in seeing him. Sokka pointed at the airbender accusingly, "I knew it. You signaled the Fire Navy with that flare. You're leading them here." "He didn't do anything. It was an accident," Katara said, defending him. "We were on the ship and the booby trap, I set it off," began Aang, only to stop once the crowd began glaring at him. Gran shook her head, sternly glaring at her granddaughter. "Katara, you shouldn't have gone on that ship, you know it is forbidden. Now we could all be in danger." "Don't blame Katara," Aang spoke, "she warned me about the ship, but I didn't listen and I convinced her to go in," Aang admitted. He bowed, "I'm sorry." "Aha!" Sokka shouted triumphantly, "The traitor confesses." "Warriors away from the enemy," ordered Sokka, making the kid step away from Aang in sadness, while Sokka kept glaring resentfully at Aang. "The foreigner is banned from the village." "Sokka, you're making a mistake," Katara argued. "No. I'm keeping my promise to Dad," Sokka retorted, "I'm protecting you from threats like him." "Aang is not our enemy," Katara yelled, "don't you see? He has brought us something we haven't had in a long time, fun." Sokka scoffed, "Fun? We can't fight firebenders with fun. You also can't fight them with 6-year-olds. Katara thought bitterly. Aang smiled. "You should try it sometime. Get out of our village," Sokka yelled. Turning towards her gran, she hoped that she would talk some sense into her brother. "Grandmother, please, don't let Sokka do this," Katara pleaded. "Katara, you knew going on that ship was forbidden." "Sokka is right. I think it is best if the airbender leaves," finalized the elder of the village, while thinking, even if he is the Avatar, I cannot risk the safety of the village. Katara was stunned at her grandmother's response. Couldn't they see that Aang wasn't dangerous? She was angry. Angry at Sokka for being stupid and tyrannical, angry at her grandmother for being so closed-minded. Well, if Sokka could make a decision like this, so can I, thought Katara. "Fine," she screamed. "Then I'm banished as well. Come on Aang, let's go," she said as she took him by the arm and walked off towards Appa. "Where do you think you're going?" Sokka questioned, shocked at his sister's actions. "To find a waterbender. He's taking me to the North Pole," she yelled back. Aang blinked. "I am?" Then smiled brightly. "Great." Sokka frowned at this, refusing to believe that Katara was taking the stranger's side. She wouldn't do that to her own Piep, would she? "Katara, you wouldn't choose them over your tribe. Your own family, would you?" Sokka voiced his thoughts out loud. This made Katara stop. "I don't know. Would I?" she thought. Sensing the inner struggle she had, Aang intervened. "Katara, I don't want to come between you and your family," Aang said, then walked off towards Appa. "So you're leaving the South Pole?" Katara asked, sadness evident in her voice. "This is goodbye." "Afraid so, but thanks for penguin sledding with me," Aang said. "Where will you go?" Katara asked. "I'll go back home, look for the airbenders." Then a thought hit him, making him shudder. "Wow, I haven't cleaned my room in 100 years. Not looking forward to that." "It was nice meeting everyone," Aang said to the village. "Let's see your bison fly now, air boy," Sokka sneered. "Come on Appa, you can do it." "Yip yip." Appa groaned, but only stood up. Sokka snorted, "I thought so." Before Appa began to walk out of the village, a little girl wailed and ran up next to Katara. "Don't go, I'll miss you," she said with small tears forming at the corner of her eyes. Aang looked at her sadly. "I'll miss you too." Aang looked at Katara, who looked back at him with sad eyes. Turning away, Aang snapped the reins and left the village. Watching Tulong was out of sight, the little girl walked back into the village sadly, next to the saddened kids. Gran walked up to her grandmother. Katara, you'll feel better after you. You happy now? Katara cut her off as she turned angrily, small tears on her eyes as well. There goes my one chance of becoming a waterbender. She stormed off, leaving Gran feeling guilty. Alright. Ready our defenses. The Fire Nation could be on our shores any moment. Sokka yelled to his troops. But I gotta. And no potty breaks. Long after Aang had left the village, Sokka had gone to his tent, for if he was going to fight the Fire Nation, he was going to fight dressed as a true Water Tribe warrior. Putting on his toughest leather's armor, pulled on his gloves, tightened his tunic, and put on black, white, and grey war paint on his face, he was ready for battle, and a small breeze swept inside the tent, making the candlelight to flicker, meaning that the enemy was nearby. Realizing this, Sokka got up and prepared to meet them head-on. At the warship, with the help of attendants, Zuko was fitted into his armor. He prepared for he was taking no chances with this battle, due to who his opponent was. A helmet with a flame emblem on the front was placed on his head. Done with his preparation, Zuko left his chambers, ready to face what was to be expected to be the battle of his life. Unfortunately, little does he know how sadly disappointed he was going to be. Sokka stood on top of the ice wall serving as a lookout, expecting the Fire Nation to arrive at any time, and he was disappointed. Suddenly, everything started to shake as a rumbling noise boomed across the village, the villagers looking up in alarm as parts of the ice wall began to crack and crumble down, along Sokka's watchtower. "Ah man," Sokka moaned seeing his tower being demolished. A huge shadow could be seen through the mist, approaching the village fast. "Ah shit," Sokka's voice cracked, watching the ship break through the frozen waters, cracking the ice even further all the way into the village. Katara was about to run for shelter, but saw a kid had fallen, and being in danger for the kid was in the way of the splitting ice, running back to get the kid, just barely rescuing him from the cracking ice. Reaching for a tent, she put him inside and turned to her brother. Sokka was still on the wall with his club raised high, like he was going to attack the ship with it. "Sokka, get out of the way." He heard Katara scream, "Trust me, I want to," were his thoughts, but his pride, determination, fear and stupidity kept him there. The ship finally reached the wall, causing it to fall back, and somehow the part Sokka was standing on stayed intact, sliding downhill in front of the ship. The bowsprit opened down with screech almost crushing Sokka, who barely moved out the way. The steam was clearing up, revealing Zuko and several Fire Nation soldiers in tow, walking down the now gangplank. Standing halfway down the gangplank, Zuko scanned the crowd, looking for someone who looked like, well, Avatarish. Meanwhile, Sokka got his bearings straight and charged at Zuko with a war cry. Zuko measly scoffed and easily kicked the club away from Sokka's hand, and then kicked Sokka in the side of his head, sending headfirst into the snow with his legs wiggling in the air, causing entire the tribe gasped in fear at how easily Sokka was beaten. They stepped back as the soldiers reached them, with Zuko still maintaining his sights at the crowd, made of nothing but women and children. "Where are you hiding him?" Zuko questioned, causing the villagers to get confused and not knowing how to respond. Getting a little frustrated, the scarred prince reached out to grab Gran out of the crowd. He'd be about this age, master of all elements, and still, they had no idea as to what he was talking about. He then pushed Gran back into Katara's arms and let loose a wave of fire over their heads, making the villagers cringe and fear even more. "I know you're hiding him," Zuko yelled. Recovering from the simple beating he received, Sokka picked up his club and charged at Zuko once again with another war cry. Zuko just mentally sighed. Stupid water peasant. He thought while ducking under Sokka and flipped him over his head and fired a blast of fire at Sokka. Rolling out of the way, Sokka reached for his boomerang and threw it at the fire prince. Zuko just narrowly avoided being hit in the head with it, gritting his teeth in anger. From the crowd, a little boy held a spear and tossed it to Sokka while crying, "Show no fear." Sokka, and for a third time, he charged at Zuko with no more success than the previous times, as Zuko just easily broke the head of the spear with his forearms and then snatched it from Sokka, bonking him the head with the butt of the spear several times before knocking Sokka down. Sadly, Zuko doesn't have eyes behind his head, for if he did, he would have noticed that the boomerang came back, hitting him in the back of his head, knocking his helmet around his face in the process. After Zuko readjusted his helmet, he glared down at Sokka with bolt fists and made two fire daggers form at the bottom of his fists. But, before he could do anything, Aang came out of nowhere as he slid from behind on top of a penguin and swept the firebender off his feet with using his staff, making Zuko land face first into the snow, with his butt in the air and his helmet landing on top of his ass, making him look like a jackass. Still sledding, Aang slid by the cheering children, covering them in snow in the process. The kids stopped their cheering, annoyed, but then started it up again. Tulong slid to a stop and was pushed off by the miffed penguin. "Hey Katara, hey Sokka," Aang greeted them, ignoring the firebenders completely. "Hi Aang, thanks for coming." Sokka thanked dryly. Zuko got up with snow on his face and turned around to face Aang as he went into his firebending stance, ready for battle. Aang adopted a serious look on his face and held his staff in front of him. They began to close in on him, but Aang acted quickly as he sent blasts of air to the men on right and then sent a blast of air to the men on his left and lastly, blasting Zuko as well, but he managed to hold his ground, shielding his face from the wind. "Looking for me?" asked Aang as he resumed his stance, circling each other. Zuko realizing who he was, he looked at the bald kid incredulously. "You're the airbender?" Zuko asked. "You're the avatar?" Asked with clearly surprise in his voice, surprising the village as everyone's eyes widened. "Aang," Katara gasped. "No way," Sokka muttered. Zuko glared at Aang as they continued to circle each other. "I've spent years preparing for this encounter, training, meditating, but you're just child," Zuko shouted. Aang relaxed his stance. "Well, you're just a teenager," he said with a shrug. Zuko fired several blasts of fire at the airbender, but Aang countered as he twirled his staff in front of him. Some of the fire, however, reached over the villagers' heads, causing them to cry out in fear. Hearing their cries, Aang turned back toward the villagers and realized that if this continued, someone innocent could get hurt. "If I go with you, will you promise to leave everyone alone?" Aang asked, signifying his surrender. Zuko never had any intentions of harming anyone, well, after seeing there were no threats. He wasn't above threatening and scaring women and children, but he wouldn't harm defenseless people. Zuko simply nodded and a soldier took his staff and Aang was led to the ship. Katara rushed forward. "No Aang. Don't do this," she cried. Aang smiled at her. "Don't worry Katara, it'll be okay," he said, but impatiently was pushed forward. "Take care of Appa for me until I get back. Head a course to the Fire Nation." Zuko bellowed. "I'm going home," finished saying as he began to walk into the ship. Aang looked back at the tribe with a sad smile as the gangplank rose, his smile dropping further when he saw Katara's eyes began to water. He knew his decision to give himself up was best for the village, but after seeing Katara shed tears for him, he didn't felt as confident about his decision. The bowsprit completely shut and the ship started to depart. A few hours had passed since Aang was taken, and the mood of the villages was somber, for not only did they banish the Avatar from their village earlier, but they were also helpless when the Fire Nation took the world's last hope for peace. Now, ashamed, sad, and hopeless, the villagers wordlessly started repairing the village. Out by the water's edge Katara stared at the horizon while Sokka was carrying some materials behind her. She has standing there for a while hoping to see Aang glide back laughing and unharmed, but a girl could only wait for so long, so she decided it was time to take action. "We have to go after that ship Sokka, Aang saved our tribe, now we have to save him," Katara declared. "Katara, why can't you realize that he's on our side? If we don't help him, no one will. I know you don't like Aang, but we owe him an eye." "Katara," Sokka yelled, tired of hearing his sister's rant. "Are you gonna talk all day or are you coming with me?" He gestured to a canoe all set to go. Katara gasped happily and hugged him. "Sokka. I don't give him enough credit. Get in, we're going to save your boyfriend." Katara blushed and began to rant at her brother. "He's not my..." "Whatever," Sokka cut her off, shrugging his shoulders in indifference. "What do you two think you're doing?" interrupted a voice. Surprised they turned around to see Gran, giving them a stern look before smiling at them. "You'll need these. You have a long journey ahead of you," she said while handing them a blue bundle, shocking the two teens. "It's been so long since I've had hope, but you brought it back to life, my little waterbender." Gran hugged Katara, then turned to Sokka. "And you, my brave warrior." Sokka stood tall, expecting some sort of praise. "Be nice to your sister." Sokka deflated and barely returned his grandmother's hug. "Yeah. Okay Gran. Aang is the Avatar, he's the world's only chance. You both found him for a reason. Now your destinies are intertwined with his." Katara looked at the canoe and sweat dropped. "There's no way we're gonna catch up to a warship with this," she said incredulously, and like a prayer answered from above, Appa appeared from over a hill with a roar. "Appa!" exclaimed the waterbender as she ran happily towards the sky bison. "You just love taking me out of my comfort zone, don't ya?" Sokka deadpanned. Meanwhile, far away from the South Pole, at a Fire Nation naval base, a tall commander wearing the traditional Fire Nation uniform, his black hair was placed in a top knot and thick sideburns on both sides of his face was in his office, standing, looking at the map that had the insignia of fire on almost every corner of the map as he stood in front of it, chuckling in arrogance. "Soon, this war will be over and the Fire Nation will reign supreme," said the man, only to be interrupted by running steps coming from the corridor. "Commander Zhao." A Fire Nation soldier rushed into the quarters, gasping for air as he saluted his higher-up. "What is it?" The commander turned towards his subordinate. "Sir, the spy we have placed in the ship belonging to Prince Zuko has reported to us that the Avatar is indeed alive and seen at the Southern Water Tribe," reported the soldier. Narrowing his eyes, he glared at him. "Are you sure?" Only for the man to nod in affirmative. Turning back towards the map, the commander was contemplating on this new piece of information, and without turning, he gave his order. "Take a fleet of 7 ships and head towards the southern tribe to retrieve the Avatar, dead or alive." Slowly turning his eyes at the soldier, he continued, "And if the villagers retaliate in capturing the Avatar, burn village to the ground." "Sir, what if the prince intervenes?" asked the soldier. Zhao stayed quiet for a few minutes till a small smirk appeared on his face. "If he interferes with the mission, then eliminate him as well." The soldier quietly saluted and went out his way to prepare for departure, leaving the commander by himself, chuckling darkly as he stared at the area that was the southern pole. On the deck of Zuko's ship, the prince and the Avatar faced each other, while Aang was still captive, and Zuko held his staff at hand, inspecting it. "This will make an excellent gift for my father." Then he looked at Aang. "But I suppose you wouldn't know of fathers being raised by monks." Aang just glared at Zuko, watching as the scarred prince flanked the staff at his uncle as he stood guard along with his captors. "Take the Avatar to the prison hold and take this to my quarters," ordered Zuko as he walked away towards his quarters. Iroh just turned to the guard next to him and handed him the staff. "Hey, you mind taking this to his quarters for me?" It was more of a command than a question. Aang looked back at his staff as he was being led down to the lower levels of the ship. Aang looked at the guards, 1 in front, 2 behind him. "Not a problem," he thought. "So I guess you never fought an airbender before. I bet I can take you all on with my hands tied behind my back." "Silence!" barked the guard. They reached a door and stopped for the lead guard to unlock it. Taking advantage while they were distracted, Aang took a deep breath and quickly exhaled, blowing a strong current of wind that slammed the guard in front of him into the door, knocking him out and sent him flying into the guard from behind, flying down the hallway as they landed on the stairs. The guard guarding his back took most of the brunt of the impact, and Aang hopped off and ran up deck. Once upstairs, Aang delivered a kick to send an air blast to the door, opening it as he dashed inside. The guard on the floor finally recovered and got up, dashing quickly upstairs, warning everyone. "The Avatar has escaped. Find him," a guard yelled. Sokka sighed as he kept trying over and over again in making Appa fly, go fly soar, for the past 10 minutes since he and his sister had been riding on Appa, the flying bison. Sokka rolled his eyes in annoyance, more like Appa the normal bison. "Please Appa, we need your help." "Aang needs your help," said Katara as she sweet-talked to the bison. Meanwhile, Sokka continued to try, up ascend elevate. Katara shot Sokka a look. "Sokka doesn't believe you can fly, but I do Appa," reaching for his head. Katara rubbed his head gently. "Come on, don't you want to save Aang?" Appa groaned. Sokka then thought of something as he put his hand on his chin. "What was it that kid said?" he asked himself. "Yeehaw. Hup hup. Wahoo. Yip yip." And the saddle began to shake as Appa groaned and flapped his tail, slowly climbing into the sky. "You did it, Sokka." Katara cheered, but Sokka was even more excited. "He's flying. He's flying." Katara he turned to his sister, but noticed Katara's smug look and calmed down. "I mean, big deal, he's flying." He couldn't help but smile though. Aang ran down another hallway, constantly looking behind for any pursuers. "Please don't let me run into anybody," Aang thought, but his luck wasn't as good as he turned the corner and ran into 3 guards. "Damn it." Smiling weakly, Aang asked them, "By chance have you seen my staff around?" The response he got were spears raised at him. Using airbending to juice his speed, Aang ran past them, running along the walls, ceiling and underneath them. "Thanks anyway," he called back. Dumbly, they looked at the trail of dust he left behind as they sweat dropped. Aang continued his search as he jumped into another hallway occupied by a firebender soldier. The soldier sent a blast of fire at him, and in one swift move, Aang jumped over the fire stream and the fire soldier, cutting the rope on his hands on one of the spikes on his helmet on midair, knocking the soldier by bringing him down. Aang looked in several rooms in search of his staff, opening door after door, till he finally reached into another room and cringed when he saw it was occupied. He relaxed slightly when he realized the old man was asleep and gently shut the door, while quietly apologizing to the sleeping man. Checking the few more rooms that were left, but in his haste to get out, Aang almost passed an open room that held what he was looking for. Too bad he didn't know it was a trap as the door was shut by the prince himself. Just as Aang had turned around to walk out of the room, staring into the eyes of an angry Zuko who got into his stance. "Looks like I underestimated you," was all Zuko said before letting loose several blasts of fire. Aang dodged around. Rolling into a corner, Aang tried to catch his breath but was forced to dodge more fireballs as he rolled under Zuko, getting behind him and barely putting one hand faced up on the prince's back, circle walking to stay behind Zuko. Zuko growled as he was unable to land any hits and jumped away to get some distance. Close combat isn't gonna work, he thought, so he fired more blasts to maintain a distance, but Aang bent the air away from the fire, making the flames die out. Dodging another fire blast, Aang jumped into the air and formed an air scooter, riding all around the room, dodging every blast that Prince sent, frustrating him even further, until the Prince sent a kick into the airball and dispersed it, sent Aang into the wall. Bedding up in a defense stance, Aang looked around the room in order to use against the Prince, and noticed the mattress laying next to Zuko, and with airbending Aang slammed the mattress, along with Zuko, into the wall and then into the ceiling, allowing the airbender a chance to escape. Once Zuko has landed on the ground, he looked up only to find the Avatar gone. Opening the hatch to the bridge, Aang poked his head out to see if the coast was clear. There was the helmsman, but beyond him was his way out to freedom. Rushing through the room to jump out from the observation deck, Aang opened his glider as he was in midair. Unfortunately, Zuko was very stubborn as he wasn't done with him as he jumped off the observation deck as well and grabbed onto Aang's foot. Aang, being unable to support the weight of he and Zuko, went crashing down into the deck. Slowly both of them got up and resumed their stance, ready to renew their battle, only to hear a growl from a distance, took their attention away from each other and looked up. "What is that?" Zuko asked out loud. "Appa," Aang exclaimed, noticing as the bison got closer, he was able to make out Katara and Sokka in Appa's saddle. With his distraction with Appa, Zuko took advantage as he almost roasted Aang with a fire blast, but Aang was able to narrowly block the blast by twirling his staff and jumped back to avoid another blast and almost fell overboard. Zuko kept firing several blasts of fire at him, one of the blasts managed to knock Aang's staff away from him. Having no choice, Aang jumped out the way of another blast of fire and landed on the rail, not noticing Zuko kicking one more ball of fire at him, and this time the airbender wasn't able to dodge it in time as he was sent over the rail and into the water unconscious. "Aang? No!" Katara cried. Aang was the Avatar, he was supposed to bring peace to the world, not die like this. "Aang?" Beside her, Sokka looked equally shocked. He may have not liked the kid that much, but he still didn't deserve that. He saved our village, and he lost his life doing it. No one should have to die that young. Zuko's eyes widened when the boy fell overboard. That wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to capture the Avatar, not kill him. Not everything was fruitless. Even if he told his father that he killed the Avatar, he doubted his father would believe him and let him back home, making Zuko tremble in rage. Aang, in his unconscious state, could feel he was in water but couldn't do anything about it. He felt tired and numb. "Aang? No. Katara." That's right, she was on Appa. "Aang? She's still in danger. Aang." Panic rose in Aang. And then it happened. Aang snapped his eyes open, and the arrow tattoos along with his eyes began to glow white. Back at Sokka and Katara's home, the tattoos of the man began to glow inside the pillar, shining brightly through the ice as it caught the attention of every person in the village. "What are you?" thought Gran as she stared from the entrance of her hut. Fully awake, the Avatar began to swim back to the surface as he twirled his body around, surrounding himself in a whirlpool. At the surface, everyone jumped in surprise as a cyclone of water shot out of the sea, and at the top was Aang with his eyes and tattoos glowing, looking directly at Zuko as he looked back at Aang in fear as he towered over the ship. Landing on deck, Aang moved his hands around, bending the water to form a circular shield around him, unleashing it on everyone on the ship, knocking the soldiers away and Zuko out of the ship. Watching from Appa's saddle, Sokka and Katara looked on in shock. "Did you see what they just did?" Katara squeaked. "Now that was some waterbending," Sokka exclaimed. Exhausted, Aang collapsed from using the Avatar state. Once Appa landed close to Aang, Katara jumped off and rushed over towards Aang. Katara shook Aang as she sat him up. "Aang, are you alright?" Aang groaned and looked at the gathered people. "Hey Katara, hey Sokka, thanks for coming." He smiled tiredly. Sokka smirked. "Well, I couldn't let you hog all the glory." Realizing that he was empty-handed, Aang looked towards his right. "I dropped my staff." "I'll get it." Sokka volunteered and ran off to get the staff, but just as Sokka picked it up, another hand grabbed it, freaking him out as he looked up and realizes that it was Zuko. Growling, Sokka tries to pull it away, but Zuko wouldn't let go, and after a short game tug-o-war battle for the staff, Sokka decided to get payback and used the staff to poke Zuko in the head, in the same way Zuko did to him back at his village, making Zuko lose his grip, almost falling into the water, but managed to grab onto the anchor chain. "That's from the water tribe," Sokka yelled triumphantly. Katara just finished helping Aang jump onto Appa when she saw the guards advance towards them. Moving her hands up, she pulled a stream of water from the puddles on the deck, scaring the guards a bit in an attempt to try to do what Aang just did. She flung her arms forward, but the water flew backwards and the water behind her froze. "Katara!" She heard Sokka yell. Turning back, she looked behind her and saw that she froze her brother's feet to the ship. The soldiers feeling confident continued in their advance, thinking she was no threat. Katara turned around and repeated what she just did, hoping for the same results. The sound of water freezing was heard. She turned around and gave a mental cheer at her handiwork. The soldiers were frozen in place with their hands out. Katara climbed on Appa and shouted at her brother, "Hurry up, Sokka." Sokka was chipping away the ice around his feet with his boomerang. "It's your fault that I'm stuck. I didn't ask for all this flying and magic. I'm just a guy with a boomerang." He got himself free and ran up Appa's tail. "Yip yip. Yip yip." Sokka cried. Iroh came out half dazed as he still was rubbing his eyes and fully awakened when he saw the giant mammal fly into the air. "Huh?" he said as he surveyed the chaos on the deck, the unconscious firebenders, the frozen guards, and his nephew struggling to get back on board. Rushing quickly towards his nephew, helping Zuko get back on the deck. "Shoot them down," ordered Zuko, but everyone was incapacitated, leaving it up to Iroh and Zuko as they went through a series of turns and launched a large ball of fire at Appa. Noticing the giant ember coming straight at them, Aang jumped to the back of the saddle, and with a swing of his staff, he released an arc of wind that deflected the fireball into an ice cliff, causing a large amount of ice fell on the ship and thus, preventing it from going any further. The kids laughed in success as they got away. Zuko glared at them, then at the snow. "Good news for the Fire Lord, the nation's greatest threat is just a child," Iroh commented. Zuko just glared at the retreating form of the bison as the Avatar continued to fly away. "I don't know how that's possible, and I don't know if that makes my task easier or harder, but I know I won't underestimate him again. Dig this ship out and follow them," ordered the prince as he turned to his crew, but sweat dropped when he saw that half were frozen and the other half was thawing them out with small flames. "As soon as you're finished with that." He finished lamely, looking back at the horizon. The sun was setting and they were still flying quietly on Appa. Katara decided now was the time to ask questions. Aang was sort of sulking as he held his knees close to his chest. "How did you do that?" she asked while scooting closer to Aang with the water. "It was the most amazing thing I've ever seen." Aang looked sideways at her. "I don't know. I just sort of did it." The two stayed silent for a while till Katara asked questions again. "Why didn't you tell us you were the Avatar?" "Because I never wanted to be," was his reply, looking away. "But Aang," Katara continued, "the world's been waiting for the Avatar to return and end the war." Aang looked down, sulking even further, "And how am I supposed to do that?" "Well, according to legend, you first need to master water, then earth, then fire, right? That's what the monks told me." "Well, if you go to the North Pole, you can master waterbending." Smiling, Aang said, "We can learn it together." Katara turned to look at her brother, "And you're still coming, right? There'll be plenty of firebender heads to knock on the way," she said in a sing-song voice. Sokka smiled a bit. "I'd like that. I'd really like that." "Then we're in this together," Katara declared. "Alright, but before I learn waterbending, we have some serious business to attend to." Aang pulled out and opened a map. "Here, here and here." He pointed to several places. "What's there?" Katara asked. "Here we'll ride the hopping llamas. Then way over here we'll surf on the backs of giant koi fish. Then back over here we'll ride the hog monkeys. They don't like people riding them, but that's what makes it fun." Aang smiled brightly at them. The siblings looked at each other, then back at the map, then at Aang, then back at each other. "Sounds cool," said Sokka, shrugging his shoulders as he leaned back against the saddle and drifted off to sleep. Turning back towards the direction of the southern water tribe, Katara could not help but feel a sense of dread on the pit of her stomach, a feeling that kept growing stronger and stronger the further they flew away. "I hope everyone stays safe," thought Katara worriedly. 2 weeks have passed since the Avatar had awakened from his slumber and journeyed towards the North Pole in order to master waterbending, but not before he made a pit stop at the Southern Air Temple, his home that he had not seen for a century. The siblings didn't know how to break it to him that the airbenders had been eradicated and that he was the last one, but for his sake, they pretended to ignore the reality that awaited him as Aang continued to show them around his home. Meanwhile, at the South Pole, a small fleet of 7 Fire Nation fleets approached their destination as they broke through the ice, the fall of black snow announcing their arrival. Children were playing in the snow, laughing and giggling as they threw snowballs at each other. One little girl was hiding behind the pillar as she kneeled down and scooped a bit of snow in her hand, gently cupping it into a ball till out of nowhere, a black flake landed on the ball. "Huh?" said the little girl as she looked up and saw a small hail of black snow befall in the village. The villagers stopped their activities as they too noticed the black ashes and grew afraid, for when black snow fell, it only meant that the Fire Navy was nearby and began to run into hiding. Gran felt an intense heat coming from above. Looking up, she saw that the Fire Nation begun their attack as they catapulted their boulders of fire, crashing into the village as it destroyed anything in its path. demolishing homes, supplies and the beam itself as it crumbled and landed on the ground with thunderous thud, while two of the Navy ships came crashing through the walls of the village and quickly lowered the bowsprit. Firebenders marched down the plank and rounded the villagers near the destroyed pillar, threatening them to kill them if they tried anything. The captain of the fleet walked in front of the villagers, staring impassively at the group. "I'm simply going to ask you once, fail to cooperate, and I'll destroy this village," informed the captain to their captives, watching as they shook genuine fear. "Where is the Avatar? I know he has been hiding in this place," demanded the captain. "He left the village already," a young woman replied with evident fear in her voice, but her only response was a blast of flames hitting and scorching the tent next to her to the ground, scaring the children as they began to cry in the arms of their mothers while they were shielded by said parent. Gran watched with fear at the burning tent as she slowly backed away from the fire till she hit something solid. Turning around, she saw that she had backed up into what was left of the ice pillar, but surprisingly, the chamber where the person was held was still intact without damage. Dropping to her knees, the elderly woman placed her hands on top of the ice and pleaded with her life, "Please, save us. Don't let the children of this village die in cold blood," Gran cried in her mind as she lowered her head. Back at the southern temple, Aang was chasing a lemur through the temple as he came down from the hill and walked through a tarp, suddenly slowing his chase, as he did not expect it to see what the room contained. Gasping in shock as he found the remains of many firebenders lying across the room, half buried in snow inside the room. "Firebenders? They were here?" muttered the young Avatar. Aang inspected the room further as he walked further down and stopped completely as his body was frozen numbed and breath caught in his throat. In the back of the room, illuminated by what little sunlight passed through, was the skeleton of an airbender monk. The robes of the air nomad were old and damaged as they were covered in dried blood, but what shocked him to the very core was that he knew who this corpse belonged to, for he could immediately identify the specific wooden necklace that hanged around the neck of the corpse. "Gyatso," muttered Aang as he fell to his knees and began to sob. Grief, anger, sadness, guilt, rage, and hopelessness raged wildly throughout his body as he cried for the death of his people. Running footsteps were approaching as the person came through the curtains, revealing Sokka as he claimed that he would not eat the lemur, only to notice that Aang had finally discovered the truth of his people's demise. Feeling sorry for the kid, the warrior slowly walked towards the grieving boy. "I'm sorry Aang, but everything will be alright. Come on, let's get out of here," Sokka said softly as he placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder, but in his rage, Aang's tattoos started to glow as he tapped into the Avatar state, causing Sokka to gasp as he was sent back by the air currents that Aang had unleashed, forming a dome of air around him as he slowly levitated off the ground. Sokka slowly got up as he held on and recoiled at the sight of his friend. Around the rest corners of the world where a temple of the Avatar was located, a miracle began to happen as each statue or murals of the Avatar began react to Aang's anger. In an Earth Kingdom temple, a priest was praying in front of a mural of several of the most famous Earth Kingdom Avatar, including Kaioshin, when their eyes started to glow gold. At the North Pole, the water shamans and its people of the Northern Water Tribe watched as a blue light began to flare brightly above the temple. At the Fire Temple in the Crescent Moon Island, the fire sages stared at the statue of Avatar Roku, watching as his eyes glow, making some of them grow amazed, confused, frightened, and, for a few, hopeful. "Send word to the Fire Lord immediately, the Avatar has returned," ordered the oldest of the sages. Bringing hopes of peace as the statues of previous avatars continued to glow. Back at the South Pole, Gran still held her hands onto the ice in hopes that the person or spirit within had heard her prayer, but the captain's patience had finally worn out. "You all refused to speak?" asked the captain again, and no one dared to speak. "So be it, by the decree of Fire Lord Ozai, I sentence each and every one of you to death," shouted the captain as the firebenders rounded and cornered the villagers, getting into their stances, forming embers in their hands as they prepared to unleash all of their fire. Soldiers exterminate them. At their order, everything began to go in slow motion as they shoot currents of flames at the villagers, causing the mothers to shield their children from harm, the screams filling the air as they closed their eyes. Gran slowly looked up as she resigned to her fate and stared into the ice, looking directly at the person within only to catch her breath in her throat as the person's eyes snapped open and began to glow a deep crimson. Tattoos on his arms and chest appeared with a glow, and everything began to tremble as the ice began to slowly break till it finally shattered completely, sending a shockwave so strong that it disperses the oncoming flames and sent the firebenders back while the captain and everyone else shielded their eyes as it spread out throughout the village while a beam of light coursed to the sky, illuminating it with its crimson glow. At the land of the Fire Nation, inside a massive volcano resided a small city with a palace in the middle, and on a balcony that was on top of the palace, a raven-haired firebender wearing a black robe with the insignia of a golden flame in the front stood, staring passively at the direction of the South Pole, smirking darkly as he barely felt the rise of power due to the distance. After 10,000 years, you're still as powerful, Namikaze, thought the man in silence, watching as the sky in the South Pole turned crimson from afar. So after many centuries have passed you have finally awakened, muttered the man as his eyes changed color from black to red with a ring around the iris, holding 3 tomos in each eye. As the light began to dim till it finally disappeared, the captain and Gran turned forward while slowly uncovering their eyes, till they were able to focus their eyesight to catch a glimpse of who or what radiated such power, and when they both saw the source of such power, they stared in shock at the being that was in front of them. A tall fair-skinned male that looked to be on his early 20s with his eyes shadowed by his spiky blonde hair and jaw-length bangs, framing either side of his face, stood in between the villagers and the firebenders. Wearing torn white pants with black metal bracers on the arms and legs with matching color shoes, but what had the village's elder captivated were the weird tattoos that framed the young man's body. A double-headed arrow pointing downward on his chest with 2 small lines going downward on the sides of his pectorals, a small circle on each shoulder with a scoop underneath it, and a spiral tattoo on each forearm, starting from his wrist to halfway up his forearm, all giving a crimson glow, but no matter what, she could not take off her eyes away from the boy's back. 4 dragons tangled with each other, looking as if they were ascending upwards, were etched on his back, as they also gave a crimson glow, and realization hit her as to who he was. "It can't be," muttered Kana as she stepped back in shock. "Who are you?" demanded the captain as he got ready into his stance with his left hand forward within a chop position, while his right hand was held in a closed fist beat close to his frame, as he readied himself to attack the unknown intruder, his underlings following suit. The blonde-haired man just barely raised his head and glared intensely at them, scaring them as they stared into his slitted eyes with redder eyes. End chapter. So this part ends here. If you want to see next part of this series, like the video now and share the story with your friends. Bye bye.